The snow lay thick upon the ancient stones of Winterfell, silencing footsteps and cloaking the world in a deep hush that stretched from the battlements to the Godswood. Jon Snow, king in the north by both acclaim and fate, stood upon the ramparts, gazing out at the courtyard with a thoughtful calm that belied the weight of the decision he had made. Though the wall had stood for millennia, though the wars had torn Westeros asunder, though dragons and White Walkers had tested men's courage and hearts, life continued. The old ways would endure, yet new paths demanded to be forged if they were all to survive and rebuild. He had come into his kingship reluctantly, for he had never sought power or glory. But events beyond his control had led him here, acknowledged by lords and sworn to protect the North. The Targaryen blood in his veins mattered far less to him than the Stark heritage in his heart. He remembered the day he found out about that secret lineage, the day his world tilted on its axis. Yet, in all that swirling confusion, he clung to the memory of what it was like to feel accepted by House Stark, the only family he had ever truly known. Now, as Winterfell wore a new mantle of snow, he quietly reflected on the gravity of bestowing the Stark name upon a chosen alliance that would unite his father's bloodline, albeit his adoptive father's bloodline, with the last living son of House Baratheon. Gendry had never asked for recognition. He was content, once upon a time, merely to shape steel and watch sparks fly in the forges. A bastard from King's Landing, taken north on a path he barely understood. He had discovered the truth of his parentage in fits and starts. Robert Baratheon's blood coursed through his veins, forging him with the same resilience the hammer had tempered in the steel he shaped. And after the wars, after the long nights shrouded in fear and the final confrontation that claimed thousands of lives, there was Gendry, still standing, unbroken, a symbol of a new generation. The storms of the past had battered him, yet he remained a steady figure with the potential to rebuild House Baratheon from the ashes of war. Jon believed in him, perhaps because he saw in Gendry the qualities he valued in any good leader: loyalty, courage, humility. As king, Jon found himself constantly balancing the old powers. House Stark had endured, but it needed strong alliances. House Baratheon was a name that had once ruled the Seven Kingdoms, but had all but vanished. Together, they could help unify a realm still healing from ravages beyond comprehension. And so, in a quiet conversation by the weirwood tree, Jon had proposed the unthinkable: a betrothal between Gendry Baratheon and Arya Stark. Jon knew it would not be an easy path. Arya was not a lady given to easy acceptance of convention, and Gendry himself was hesitant to claim any lordship. But the North needed more than swords. It needed alliances. And the forging of this pact would be a sign that Winterfell was committed to a stronger, more unified kingdom. He had expected Arya to protest more vehemently, but he found, to his surprise, that she did not immediately refuse. Her gray eyes had studied him for a long moment when he first suggested it. She did not talk about love or about what she wanted for herself, which worried him. In her quiet acceptance, he sensed she had matured beyond the brash, wild girl who used to practice with a wooden sword in the courtyard. Arya Stark had traveled the length and breadth of the known world, faced unimaginable horrors, lost herself and found herself again. She was no longer a girl who recoiled at the idea of ladyship, nor was she someone easily cowed by tradition. Instead, she accepted because she saw a purpose in it. If forging a pact through marriage could bring peace to the North, she would do it. If it could heal the realm, she would endure it. It was not romantic, and perhaps that was the most heartbreaking part. Gendry received the news in a swirl of disbelief and awkward gratitude. That evening, summoned to Jon's solar, he stood with his strong arms folded across his broad chest, listening quietly as Jon laid out the reasons. He had never expected a title or a keep. He barely knew what to do with Storm's End when it had been granted to him as recognition of his heritage. The letter from the crown had legitimized him, naming him Gendry Baratheon, granting him lordship over the ancient seat of House Baratheon. But the notion of marrying Arya Stark, a woman who had saved him, who had fought alongside him, who had shared more than just the hardships of war, struck him with the force of a warhammer to the chest. There had always been a bond, an unspoken connection, A time came when he once longed for something more, but circumstances had changed drastically since then. Now, being part of a political alliance would shape both their futures, and it seemed surreal to think that love or affection might be overshadowed by duty. Jon was not blind to the complexities. That evening, the candlelight flickered over the maps and scrolls spread across his table. Every alliance was a gamble. A union with a resurgent House Baratheon would give the North a powerful partner against any further threats from the South. Despite the best intentions, the South did not trust easily, and if the North was to stand strong, it needed more than just the memory of dragons and the threat of winter. Gendry, for his part, listened, nodded, and eventually agreed. Not because he was starry-eyed with ambition, but because he, too, saw a greater good in it. If a union could protect the realm, if it could serve to mend the fractures that had threatened them all, he would do his part, even if it meant stepping out of the forge and into the great hall of lords and ladies. Winterfell bustled with preparations as soon as word spread. Lords from across the north were summoned, and many came willingly, if somewhat surprised at the notion of betrothing Arya Stark to a southern lord, even if that southern lord was half a northerner at heart. Within the castle walls, Sansa Stark took immediate charge of the practical matters, from feast preparations to accommodations. She had learned the arts of governance and courtesy, forging alliances through subtlety and skill. Now she pressed her talents into ensuring the betrothal ceremony would be a statement of unity, something that even the most reluctant lords could not ignore. She consulted with Jon daily, sending ravens across the realm. The king in the north observed her tireless work, each carefully penned invitation, each thoughtful arrangement, and found himself grateful that the north had her as well. Arya, meanwhile, went about the preparations with a stoic acceptance. She found new ways to slip away from the maddening bustle whenever she could. She went to the armory, to the crypts, to the godswood, anywhere she might breathe freely. She disliked the idea of being the center of attention. She loathed the fuss, but this was her role to play now, and she would do it. Gendry, for his part, wandered the courtyards and the corridors in a quiet haze. He had come to Winterfell to fight for the living, never anticipating that one day he would be pacing these halls as a prospective husband to Arya Stark. He tried to find solace in the forge, stoking the fires and shaping metal, letting the clang of steel on steel calm his racing thoughts. Some of the castle smiths recognized him from the war, greeting him with respect. Gendry's hammer was as famous in Winterfell as Arya's sword, needle. Yet now his mind was on a much weightier forging. The forging of a bond, the forging of a new alliance. On the day that the betrothal was to be formally announced, a hush fell over Winterfell. Lords and ladies gathered in the great hall. The large hearth crackled with fresh logs, casting a warm glow on the stone walls. Tapestries depicting wolves in snowy landscapes were draped behind the high table, where Jon Snow sat in the seat once held by Ned Stark. On either side stood Sansa and Bran, solemn and regal in their new roles. Arya stood near the dais, clothed in a dark gray gown that suited her tastes. Simple, unadorned, practical enough that she would not feel too much like an ornament. She wore her hair in a single braid over one shoulder, a faint sign of concession to formality. Gendry stood opposite her, attired in dark leathers trimmed with gold thread, a subtle acknowledgement of his Baratheon lineage without overwhelming the setting with southern pomp. One by one, the lords pledged their fealty to Jon as king in the north, each mindful that a union was about to be declared. The great hall was alive with murmurs. Some whispered curiosity, others outright skepticism. But no one interrupted the proceedings. Gendry's bright blue eyes occasionally flicked to Arya, who maintained a composed, distant expression. When she finally met his gaze, he gave the slightest nod, trying to communicate some measure of understanding. That moment, fleeting as it was, reminded him of the old days. Traveling together, sharing the cold nights, forging an unspoken friendship that had been tested by war. Jon stood. The hall quieted instantly. He was dressed in stark gray, a fur-trimmed cloak draped over his broad shoulders. Though he wore no crown, the northern lords recognized him as their king by his presence and bearing. In a measured voice, he spoke of unity, of the need to bind houses together. He recalled the devastation wrought by the wars, the near destruction of everything they held dear, and how only through cooperation had they managed to overcome the long night. As he spoke of House Baratheon, a ripple of memory passed through the crowd. Robert Baratheon had once been a beloved friend of Ned Stark, and the bond between the two houses had shaped the fate of Westeros. Now, in a new era, Jon believed it fitting that the two houses be joined once more, sealing old friendships and forging new alliances. His announcement was made without fanfare, but with clear authority. Arya Stark and Gendry Baratheon would be betrothed, and the ceremony would take place before the moon turned again. Jon's voice echoed in the great hall, and the lords gathered there bowed their heads in acknowledgement. Some faces wore approval, others cautious acceptance. A few seemed uncertain, but none dared openly challenge the king's decision in that moment. The war had taught them that unity was often the difference between life and death. Arya and Gendry approached Jon as two separate individuals on that dais. When they stood beside him, Jon took each of their hands and clasped them together. A murmur swept across the hall at the sight, the slender hand of Arya Stark disappearing into the calloused, blacksmith-scarred hand of Gendry Baratheon. For a moment, the two of them stood like that, uncertain but resolute, bound by a sense of duty. Perhaps some part of Gendry hoped Arya felt some echo of warmth, some reminder of the closeness they once shared, but he could not decipher the careful mask on her face. Sansa's applause was the first to break the hush. Others joined in, though the applause felt measured, careful. In that instant, a union was declared, not yet sealed, but set upon a path. And so the North entered a new chapter, with the promise of a stronger bond to the memory of House Baratheon, a bond that might well shape the future of Westeros if tended carefully. That night, Winterfell did not launch into raucous celebrations. The betrothal feast was more of a solemn gathering, a reminder of responsibilities and alliances rather than a carefree revel. The tables were laden with winter fare, roasted game, dark bread, thick stews, and spiced wine. Lords and ladies found corners to speak quietly, while others tried to engage Gendry or Arya in polite conversation. Gendry had never been comfortable with such talk. He found himself nodding along to remarks about the forging of alliances, about the significance of his heritage, about how an alliance with House Stark might create a new golden age for House Baratheon. Politely, he thanked them, though he felt an undercurrent of unease, as though the steel that was being tested here was not just political but personal. Arya, too, endured the watchful eyes of guests. She sidestepped questions about the wedding details, preferring to stand by the fire or retreat to the shadows of the hall. Every so often, she would lift her eyes to find Gendry in conversation, and a part of her would twist. She remembered so many things. The journey north, the way he had teased her about being a lady all those years ago, the hours they spent fighting side by side. She found it strange and even a little ironic that the moment when Gendry had once offered to be her family, when he was no more than a nameless bastard with a hammer, she had declined him. Now, the realm demanded they bind themselves together, and both had changed so much. She wondered what pieces of themselves remained the same. After the feast, Jon summoned both Arya and Gendry to the solar, the room lit by a few sputtering candles and the dying embers of a fire. Sansa was there as well, her expression calm and composed. Jon poured them all a measure of strong northern spirits. He raised his cup, unceremoniously, and offered a simple toast, to a bond that will protect the North and honor our father's memories. They drank. The liquor burned in their throats, but no one spoke immediately. The quiet allowed the wind outside to whistle a lonely tune against the tower walls. Jon set his cup down, sighing. This was never my intention, to press either of you into something you didn't want. But the alliances we forge now, they may decide if we can keep the peace we've fought so hard for. I would not have suggested this if I didn't believe in both of you. You have my word. Arya's face betrayed no anger, no bitterness. She simply studied Jon with that penetrating gaze of hers. I know, she said quietly. We do what we must. Gendry nodded in agreement, his voice gruff from disuse. I'm no lord by upbringing, but I'll do my best. For the north, for Storm's End. If the realm needs this, then so be it. Sansa watched them from her seat by the fire, her hands folded in her lap. She spoke softly. Perhaps you two should spend some time together in these next weeks, so it will not feel so forced. You knew each other once, you fought alongside one another. It might be easier if you remember that history as friends. Arya's lips twitched as though she might laugh, but no laugh emerged. Gendry glanced her way, remembering when they were not so burdened by titles and the fates of houses. Jon remained silent, giving them space to respond. Finally, Arya agreed with a slight nod, and Gendry, summoning some small smile, added, "Friends, yes, that's a start." The night ended without further ceremony. Arya departed for her chambers, mindful of the side glances from the guards as she passed. Gendry walked the corridors alone, the hush of Winterfell embracing him. He went to the forge out of habit, found it empty and dark. In the gloom, the memory of forging dragonglass weapons for the war came back to him, the frantic attempts to arm every man and woman against the dead. Those days had been full of desperation, but also a strange camaraderie. Now the world had changed. He was no longer a simple blacksmith. The ring of metal on metal echoed in his imagination, a memory rather than a present comfort. In the days that followed, Winterfell's routine resumed with only modest disruption from the looming betrothal. Arya rose early to train, as she always had, sometimes seeking out the courtyard to practice her footwork with a wooden staff, or to loose arrows at straw targets beyond the walls. Gendry, still uneasy in his lordly role, found common ground among the blacksmiths, offering advice on forging techniques. He found a surprising peace when holding a hammer, even if he no longer swung it from dawn till dusk. Occasionally, their paths crossed. Once in the courtyard when Gendry stood with a small group of guards discussing a piece of weaponry, and Arya finished her archery practice. She caught his eye, nodded a greeting. He watched her unerringly hit target after target. Neither said much, but in the shared silence, they recalled the sense of what once bound them together. Winterfell's corridors seemed narrower as time pressed on. Word of the betrothal spread beyond the north, and ravens arrived from distant corners of Westeros. Some letters carried congratulations, others expressed polite curiosity. A few implied that House Stark was overstepping, forging an alliance with a newly legitimized Baratheon. But Jon and Sansa handled the politics, leaving Arya and Gendry to walk that delicate path of reacquaintance. Under the watchful eyes of the entire castle, each attempt at conversation felt stiff, as though they were both unsure of the new roles they had been thrust into. One day, Arya ventured into the Godswood, seeking the quiet rustle of ancient leaves and the steady hush of the weirwood tree. The air was crisp, and the ground glistened with a thin layer of frost. She ran her gloved hand over the carved face of the old tree, its red leaves fluttering overhead like silent witnesses. The eyes of the weirwood had watched over generations of Starks. Arya came here often to remind herself that, no matter how far she had traveled, some part of her belonged in this place. She had not expected to find Gendry already there, standing off to the side, his breath visible in the cold air. He looked at her with mild surprise, then an apologetic smile touched his lips. "I've never spent much time around weirwoods," he said by way of explanation. "Just wanted to see what it's like to be here alone. Feels still." Arya nodded. "It's as good a place as any for quiet. Most people here are either too busy to linger or they consider it sacred and keep their distance." He glanced up at the red leaves, the pale bark. "Do you come here often?" Arya weighed her answer. "When I need to think, or when I need to remember who I am." Silence settled between them, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. Finally, Gendry took a hesitant step closer. "I know this is awkward, but Sansa's right. We do need to talk. All these people looking at us, waiting for this grand display." He paused, searching her eyes. "I don't want to force anything, but I also don't want you to think I'm indifferent. I never was." She bowed her head, her braids slipping forward over her shoulder. "I know. I remember everything from before, and from the war too. She traced the grooves of the weirwood bark with one finger. I wanted so many different things back then. Sometimes I still don't know what I want. Gendry exhaled softly, stepping even closer so he could speak without fear of being overheard. You once said you could be anyone. I remember you telling me that, but I know you'd rather be yourself. This arrangement, maybe we can make it ours in some way, not just a duty forced upon us. I want to try, at least. Arya's lips tightened into a brief smile. I don't want to be a lady, kept in a castle to sew and chatter about dinner parties. That will never be who I am. He gave a small laugh. I don't think anyone could force you to be that, Arya. And the North is hardly the same as King's Landing. You'll have your freedom. And if you want to travel, I suppose we could find ways. I'm not much for ceremony either. She studied him for a moment. The Gendry she knew was still there beneath the slight discomfort of new clothes and newfound responsibilities. She recalled how he once insisted he was only good at forging steel. Now, circumstances demanded he forge Ife for both of them, for the houses they represented. She let out a slow breath. I won't make promises I can't keep, but I'll try to build something that honors what we both value. We owe at least that much to the people who trust us with their futures. He nodded, relief flickering in his eyes. The hush of the gods would envelop them once more, a gentle acceptance of their quiet conversation. Neither moved for a while, until finally Arya stepped away from the tree. She looked at Gendry and gestured vaguely at the path leading back to the castle. We should return. Sansa will be expecting us for whatever dinner she's arranged. Together, they left the Godswood, the hush of the ancient trees trailing behind them like an old memory. In that moment, a tenuous understanding formed between them, a willingness to at least walk side by side, rather than separately. The news of the betrothal eventually brought a small party from the south. These were minor lords tied to Storm's End, men who had served House Baratheon for years and who were curious to see their new lord. Their arrival injected a spark of southern color into the stark grays and whites of Winterfell. They brought bright doublets, gilded scabbards, a few barrels of southern wine. Their presence unsettled some of the northern lords, who were wary of too much southern influence creeping into their domain. But they respected Jon's decisions, and so they greeted the newcomers cordially. Gendry spent time with them, gleaning knowledge about Storm's End, its management, and the expectations placed upon a lord of that ancient fortress. He often returned to Arya afterward, mentioning what he had learned. The endless crashing of the sea against the formidable walls, the storms that battered the region, the fertility of the surrounding lands that, if well managed, could keep an entire army fed. Arya, for her part, listened more intently than Gendry expected. She seemed quietly interested in the practicalities of running a castle besieged by storms, asking him questions about the challenges it faced, the sorts of defenses it had, the terrain surrounding it. If the two of them were to be bound, she reasoned, she might as well understand what it meant for her future. One evening, they found themselves alone in the library, a drafty chamber lined with shelves of old tomes. Arya was thumbing through a book detailing the genealogies of noble houses. She paused at House Baratheon's entry, scanning the complicated lines of descent. There was a sense of pride in the words, describing Orys Baratheon, rumored half-brother to Aegon the Conqueror, and how he had been granted Storm's End centuries ago. Gendry approached, a half-smile tugging at his mouth. Brushing up on the family history? Arya didn't look up from the book. We do what we must, right? I thought I'd learn something about your house. I know plenty of stories about Robert, but that's about it. He stood beside her, trying to decipher the looping script of the ancient text. It still feels strange to me. I was no one for so long. No last name, no place I belonged. Suddenly I'm Gendry Baratheon, Lord of Storm's End. I'm not sure I'll ever feel at ease with it. Arya closed the book. You will. You've survived worse changes than a name. If you can handle whites, the army of the dead, and all the madness we've seen, you can handle a few fawning lords. He chuckled, glancing around the library. And what of you? Will you be able to handle being Lady of Storm's End? The question hung in the air. Arya set the book down carefully. I don't know, she admitted. The label sounds false to my ears. I haven't lived the life of a lady for years. I'm not even sure I did before that, truly. But there's more to ruling than embroidery and pleasantries. Someone has to keep the place safe, watch over the people, keep order. That I understand. Gendry rested a hand against the back of a chair. You'd do well at it, I think, because you've seen how easily people can be oppressed. You've seen how cruelty can hide behind titles. I can't imagine you'd ever stand for that. Her gaze flickered, and she nodded. We'll see. At least we'll have each other's measure in this. Another silence stretched between them, but this one felt warmer, less burdened by the awkwardness of forced duty. Gendry reached out and lightly touched her arm. She did not pull away. I'm trying to find a path forward that doesn't push you into a cage, Arya. We've both lost so much. If there's a way for us to regain something, maybe companionship or respect, that can only help. She turned to him, her gray eyes steady. As I said in the Godswood, I'll try. I won't pretend it's all easy or something I'm longing for. But you're a good man, Gendry. That's more than enough reason to believe we can make something decent of this. He offered a rueful smile. Decent. I suppose that's better than the alternative. And so they parted that night feeling slightly less like strangers forced into a pact, and more like two individuals who might share a meaningful alliance, not just for the sake of Westeros, but for themselves as well. The betrothal period passed in a succession of small steps and large gatherings. Arya and Gendry sat together at feasts, walked through the courtyard side by side. They were seen together in the training yard, occasionally sparring with wooden swords. Some of the older lords, baffled by Arya's open love of martial pursuits, whispered their concerns, but no one openly challenged the king in the North's decision. Besides, Gendry sparred with her without shame, acknowledging her skill in a way that startled onlookers. The hush that would descend as they circled each other, or traded swift blows, gradually softened into mild admiration. If Gendry, a man of formidable strength, respected Arya's prowess, who were they to question it? Jon observed this from a distance, aware that the entire realm would soon speak of the North forging a new path, one where tradition and necessity might blend in unexpected ways. Sansa, ever the strategist, noticed how the subtle displays of unity between Arya and Gendry alleviated doubts among certain factions. Bran, more aloof, seemed to understand that all paths converged in Winterfell for a reason, though he kept his thoughts shrouded in cryptic statements that only occasionally offered clarity. On the eve of the wedding ceremony, the atmosphere in Winterfell changed. Worry and excitement intermingled, as if the very stones felt the weight of this new bond. Servants rushed to ready the great hall for the feast. A hush of anticipation gripped the castle. The wedding itself was to follow northern customs. Gendry, though of southern birth, had accepted that if he was to bind with House Stark, he would adhere to their traditions, honoring the old gods, standing before the heart tree, and making his vows there. He found it a small concession. He had no devotion to the faith of the Seven. After all, having grown up in the slums of King's Landing without ever setting foot in the Grand Septs, the old gods felt more honest, if anything, a silent watchfulness, ancient and stern. That night, Arya stood in her chamber, regarding herself in a polished metal mirror. She wore a practical gown, once again simple in cut, in the gray and white tones of House Stark. Her hair was braided in the northern style, a few strands left loose, framing her face. The reflection stared back at her, uncertain but resolute. She remembered a time when she was a little girl, running wild through these corridors, longing for adventure, sword fighting with a stick. That girl had died 1,000 times over, been reborn with names she chose and names she discarded. Now she was Arya Stark once more, about to be wed under the eyes of the old gods. Her heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of trepidation and acceptance. Sansa entered the room quietly, her footfalls muffled on the rug. She carried a small pin in her hand, shaped like the dire wolf of House Stark. Wordlessly, she approached Arya, pinning it just beneath her left shoulder. "It belonged to our mother," she explained softly. "It's something she wore on her cloaks. I thought it fitting you have it now." Arya touched the pin with careful fingers, her eyes momentarily flickering with emotion. "I'm not sure I can fill her shoes, Sansa." Sansa offered a sad, understanding smile. "You aren't meant to. You fill your own. Mother would have wanted you to have this, to remind you that you are still part of this family. Nothing will change that." Arya swallowed hard, nodding. Sansa regarded her with a gentle affection that only surfaced in rare moments. The two sisters had come a long way from the petty rivalries and misunderstandings of their youth. War and loss had forged a stronger bond between them, one not easily broken by differing temperaments. "I'm proud of you," Sansa said quietly. "I know how difficult this is." Arya mustered a faint smile. "Thank you, Sansa. I appreciate everything you've done to make this smoother for me." She turned to face her sister fully. "I'm not good with these sorts of words, but I need you to know I'm grateful." Sansa reached out, squeezed Arya's hand. "I know. Now come, it's time. The guests are gathering." Across the castle, Gendry was pacing his own chamber, heart pounding. He wore a dark doublet trimmed with gray fur at the shoulders, a nod to the north, with a small crest of the black stag of Baratheon embroidered in the corner. His hammer, polished and ceremonial, leaned against the wall, a reminder of where he came from. He didn't possess Ned Stark's sword or the Targaryen lineage that fueled legends, but he had his own strength, and that would have to suffice. He thought about the journey that brought him here, working in Tobo Mott's smithy, running from Lannister guards, ending up in the Brotherhood without banners, crossing paths with Arya Stark, fighting in the Great War. Now a new battle, the forging of an alliance that might shape the future of Westeros. A soft knock announced Davos Seaworth, who had journeyed north upon hearing the news. Davos entered, smiling quietly, a paternal warmth in his eyes. "You look well, lad," the older man said, closing the door behind him. "Hardly the poor smith's apprentice I first met." Gendry inhaled sharply. "Feels strange, Ser Davos, standing here about to marry Arya Stark. I feel I'm stepping into a story someone else wrote." Davos placed a hand on Gendry's shoulder. "We all find ourselves in stories that began before we were born. The trick is making your own mark. And you, Gendry Baratheon, are doing just that. Lord of Storm's End, forging a bond with the North. Robert would be... well, the old king would be quite astonished, I'd wager." Gendry laughed, a touch of nervousness in his voice. "I'm not sure Robert ever wanted me to be anything other than invisible, if he knew I existed at all. But maybe he'd be proud in his own way." "Pride comes in many forms," Davos said. "Your father had his flaws, like every man, but you stand on your own merits. Don't forget that." They left the chamber together, descending the corridors into the courtyard, where a small procession formed under torchlight. The setting sun bathed Winterfell in muted hues of gold and purple, while the wind carried a chill that reminded them all of the looming winter nights. Gendry could see, across the courtyard, Jon and Sansa waiting with Arya, along with Bran and a handful of the more prominent northern lords. Closer by, the southern lords who followed Gendry to Winterfell stood in respectful silence, a few holding torches as well. The wedding was to be held in the Godswood, under the face of the weirwood tree, as per northern tradition. As the assembled party processed through the snow-dusted paths, the quiet of the approaching night embraced them. Red leaves shimmered overhead, and the moon's pale glow caught the frost on the branches, turning the woods into a place of ethereal beauty. Arya walked at Jon's side, her grip on his arm steady, though her expression was unreadable. Gendry moved forward, meeting her near the heart tree. They turned to face one another, the old gods as their silent witnesses. Jon officiated the ceremony in the northern style, speaking of how House Stark's blood had mingled with House Baratheon's in friendship before, and how this wedding would honor the old alliances and forge new ones. A hush held the gathering in thrall as Gendry took Arya's hands in his own. She looked at him, her gray eyes intense, yet calmer than he had ever seen them. Under the canopy of red leaves, they spoke their vows in voices soft but unwavering, promising to stand beside each other, to guard one another's backs, to protect each other's interests and the interests of those who looked to them for guidance. They kissed, a brief, almost shy contact that felt at once surreal and necessary. Applause mingled with hushed murmurs. Even the wind seemed to die down for an instant, as though the old gods themselves paused to acknowledge the union. Arya and Gendry stepped back, wearing matching expressions of relief and solemnity. It was done. They were man and wife, lady and lord, Arya Stark of Winterfell and Gendry Baratheon of Storm's End, forging a link between the wolf and the stag once more. The wedding feast took place in the Great Hall, lit by roaring hearths and filled with the rich aroma of spiced meats and fresh bread. Wine flowed freely, as did Northern Alish. Sansa had spared no effort in ensuring the hall's decorations were tasteful but celebratory. Simple greenery woven with a few Baratheon and Stark banners. Musicians played lively tunes, and though the overall atmosphere remained more reserved than southern courts might expect, there was an undeniable energy in the air, a sense of cautious hope. Arya and Gendry sat at the high table beside Jon and Sansa. Now and again, people approached to offer congratulations, to toast their health, to admire the improbable union. Davos gave Gendry a fond pat on the back and a nod of respect to Arya. Podrick Payne, representing a small delegation from the Vale, stumbled through a polite speech about new beginnings. Even Tormund Giantsbane, who had lingered in the north, raised his horn of mead and bellowed that any wife who could wield a sword as well as Arya Stark deserved a fine, strong husband, a comment that made Gendry and Arya exchange an awkward smile. But for the most part, the evening passed in a swirl of conversation and music. When the formalities ended and the feast began to wind down, Arya excused herself from the high table. She slipped through the crowd, into the shadows near one of the large hearths. Gendry watched her go, understanding that she needed some space. After a few minutes, he followed, finding her by a dimly lit alcove. She was leaning against the stone, looking into the flickering flames with a faraway expression. He approached quietly. "You've done well tonight," he said softly, as though praising her for some feat of arms. "I know this isn't your kind of gathering." She glanced at him, a wry tilt to her lips. "I'm not much for dancing and feasting, but it's done. We made it through." He chuckled. "We did. I think half the people here are just grateful another alliance is sealed. Maybe they believe it means fewer wars." She turned to face him, the firelight casting shadows across her features. "That's the hope, isn't it? That by uniting our houses we can keep the peace, or at least stave off further chaos." He reached out carefully and tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "Do you think they'll leave us alone now? Let us figure out what comes next on our own terms." Arya shook her head. "People like this are always watching, always judging, but I don't really care about their gossip. We'll do what we must. That's all." A faint smile touched Gendry's lips. He marveled at how this small gesture, standing together away from prying eyes, felt more intimate and real than the ceremony under the weirwood. "As long as we do it together," he said softly, and for the first time, he allowed himself to acknowledge that a part of him was genuinely happy about the possibility of sharing a future with someone who understood what it meant to fight for survival. She studied his face in the firelight. "I won't be tamed, Gendry Baratheon," she said, a trace of the old defiance in her tone. He laughed, a soft, low rumble. "I wouldn't dream of it, Arya Stark." They stood in companionable silence, letting the warmth of the hearth shield them from the winter chill that pressed against the castle walls. In that moment, they were no longer merely the subjects of a realm-wide alliance, but two individuals who had witnessed each other's strengths and vulnerabilities, forging a tenuous bond in a world that had often taken far more than it gave. Later that evening, the time came for them to retire. The marriage had been consummated in the eyes of the gods at the Heart Tree, but the mortal lords of Westeros still expected certain formalities. Arya felt a tension coil in her stomach as she made her way through the torchlit corridors to the chambers they would now share. Gendry followed at a respectful distance, neither pushing nor shrinking from what lay ahead. Though duty demanded the union be sealed physically, he intended to tread gently, mindful of her comfort. The door to their bedchamber was made of thick wood, the iron handle cool to the touch. Arya paused before it, a storm of thoughts in her mind. Gendry stepped up beside her, his expression gentle, no trace of expectation or demand. With a quiet nod, she opened the door, and they both entered. The room was lit by a handful of candles, a small fire crackling in the hearth. Fur blankets lay piled on the large bed, a northern necessity against the chill nights. Arya set about removing the small bits of jewelry and trinkets she'd worn for the wedding. She placed them carefully on a side table, aware of Gendry's presence behind her. She could feel his nervousness as tangibly as her own, and somehow that offered a measure of comfort. This was new and uncertain for him too. He was no rakish lord with cunning words. He was Gendry, once a humble smith, now a lord by chance, no more at ease in this role than she was in hers. He eased closer until she could sense his warmth. Gently, he brushed her hair aside and placed a soft kiss on her shoulder. A shiver ran through her, part apprehension, part something else. She turned to face him, resting a hand on his chest. In the silence, neither needed to utter grand declarations of love, but they acknowledged a blossoming respect, a quiet acceptance of each other's scars, both visible and invisible. When he finally kissed her, it was tentative, seeking permission and offering reassurance. As the night wore on, they found a fragile intimacy that, while not wholly unburdened by the weight of duty, carried a tenderness that neither expected. Each had survived a brutal world of violence and loss, and both had carved new lives from the ruins of war. Under the blankets and the soft candlelight, they fumbled toward a mutual understanding. If love was not yet fully formed between them, there was the seed of camaraderie, of trust, of empathy. In the silence that followed, as they lay side by side, they both wondered if this was how new beginnings took root, in quiet acceptance rather than ardent passion. Dawn came softly through the shutters, the winter sun pale but insistent. They rose, somewhat awkwardly, to the fresh demands of the day. If the wedding day had been filled with formality, the morning after was even more rife with subtle glances from the castle staff. Arya met the curious gazes with a measured calm that dared anyone to comment. Gendry, though feeling the weight of new expectations, managed to maintain his polite smiles. They broke their fast at the high table with Jon, Sansa, and Bran. No one pried, though Sansa's quick glances carried a concerned warmth, and Jon's small nod seemed to say, "We are bound by responsibility, but we are also family. If you need anything, I am here." Soon enough, life in Winterfell resumed its rhythms. The wedding guests began to depart, returning to their own lands now that the vow was sealed. Gendry started making preparations for a journey to Storm's End, for the realm expected him to eventually preside over his seat and ensure its loyalty to the new order. Arya prepared to accompany him, an arrangement that still felt strange in her heart, as she had never imagined leaving Winterfell again under such circumstances. But the notion of seeing a new part of Westeros through this lens intrigued her, even if it was tempered by the sense of stepping deeper into a role not entirely of her choosing. Before they left, Jon called a council meeting in the Great Hall. The topic, the broader alliances in Westeros and how the union between House Stark and House Baratheon might shift the political landscape. Seated around the table were several of the North's key bannermen, Davos as a representative of the crown's broader interests, and a few of the southern lords who had remained behind. Bran sat quietly, his gaze distant as though peering into realms beyond mortal sight. Sansa presided with her usual grace, guiding the discussion. Gendry and Arya sat side by side, an unusual pair among these seasoned lords, yet no one doubted their place. The talk was of trade routes, crop distributions, naval forces in the Stormlands, of how resources might be shared to bolster both houses, ensuring that the North had reliable access to southern goods while Storm's End benefited from the grit and unity of the North. Gendry, though inexperienced in the finer points of governance, had a knack for practical solutions. Arya chimed in occasionally, her comments focusing on security and defenses. More than once, heads turned at the straightforwardness of her ideas. Some lords were not used to hearing a lady speak so bluntly about the logistics of warfare and land defense. But if they were shocked, they kept their tongues still, for Arya was now Lady of Storm's End, and she was the king in the North's beloved sister. The meeting concluded with a set of goals and timetables. Gendry and Arya would depart within a fortnight for the Stormlands, accompanied by a modest retinue that included some of the northern bannermen, a few southern lords, and enough guards to ensure safe passage. The roads were safer than they'd been in years, but the realm was not yet devoid of bandits or rogue sellswords. Arya found herself restless at the prospect of traveling with a large party. She was used to slipping through the world unnoticed, but she recognized that times had changed, and her role demanded a visible presence. The days leading up to their departure passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Winterfell's forges rang with the sound of steel on steel as Gendry commissioned fresh weapons and tools to bring south. Arya spent her time ensuring her personal gear was in order, collecting maps and discussing the route with the most seasoned knights. Sansa continued to handle the political correspondences, writing letters to major houses that needed reassurance about the new alliance. Jon took every quiet moment he could to speak with Arya and Gendry separately, ensuring both were content with their path and reminding them that Winterfell would always welcome them home. Finally, the day of departure arrived. The courtyard was filled with horses, wagons, and men-at-arms. Stables bustled with last-minute checks on the mounts. Arya emerged wearing riding leathers and a thick cloak of gray wolf fur. Needle, forever her companion, hung at her waist. Gendry wore similar attire, albeit with a slight southern flair, a black surcoat embroidered with a stag's head. The two looked more like traveling warriors than lord and lady, which suited them both. Jon and Sansa stood by to see them off. The king in the north gripped Gendry's forearm in farewell. "Take care of her," he said quietly. "Take care of each other." Gendry nodded solemnly. "I will, I swear it." Sansa hugged Arya for a long moment, whispering, "Write to us. Let us know how things go, and don't hesitate if you need anything." Arya smiled, genuine affection shining in her eyes. "I will. You keep watch here, too. Don't let the lords bore you to death." With the final farewells exchanged, the party set forth from Winterfell's gates, a modest column of riders and carriages. Snow crunched under hoof, and the cold northern wind bit at their cheeks. Arya glanced back once at the receding figure of Winterfell, the home that had shaped her identity. Then she turned her gaze forward, to the road ahead, a road that led south to Storm's End and a future she had yet to define. As they traveled, the land shifted from snow-covered pines to frost-laden fields, then gradually to rolling hills as they moved beyond the domain of perpetual winter. At the lead of the group, Arya and Gendry rode side by side, occasionally conferring with scouts who rode ahead. They spoke of small things, how the weather softened as they neared the crossroads, how villages that had once been ravaged by war were slowly rebuilding. Now and then, a villager would recognize them, or at least see the banners, the direwolf of House Stark and the black stag of House Baratheon. Whispers spread of the Union, some murmuring that perhaps it was a sign of better times, others simply gazing in awe at the sight of a Stark traveling with a Baratheon once more. Arya kept her senses alert, half expecting trouble at every turn. Ambushes, assassins, or ghosts of old conflicts. But the journey remained largely uneventful. When they stopped at inns, the owners were respectful, eager to accommodate, seeing in Gendry and Arya not just lords, but perhaps saviors who had fought to protect the realm from the undead. Many still remembered the nightmares of the long night. Evenings around the campfire were quieter affairs. The guards and bannermen shared stories, drank ale, and occasionally teased Gendry about his new status, though mostly good-naturedly. Arya often preferred the perimeter, prowling around the edges of the firelight to keep watch or to lose herself in thought. Yet sometimes, she would sit by Gendry, legs stretched out toward the flames, and allow herself a moment of warmth and companionship. In those small moments, neither needed to speak much. They found a rhythm in the silence, anchored by the memories of what they had overcome. After many days' travel, they reached the Stormlands, where the air grew damp and the clouds overhead bore the promise of tempestuous weather. The sea wind carried a salt tang, and a new energy seemed to course through Gendry as they approached the land he was supposed to rule. Even if it felt foreign to him, there was a primal call to the crashing waves that matched something in his blood, Baratheons had been storm lords for centuries. After all, Storm's End finally appeared on the horizon, its massive walls defying the pounding surf. Built in the days of the first men and said to be impenetrable against both storm and siege, the castle stood perched on a rocky promontory, enduring the endless assault of wind and rain. As they drew closer, the drizzle turned into a steady downpour, soaking cloaks and plastering hair to faces, but no one complained aloud. This was the price of entry, a baptism of storm for those who would stand beneath those ancient battlements. Gendry gazed up at the towering walls, awe flickering in his eyes. He had never set foot here before, yet a sense of reverence crept into him. This was his inheritance, his father's seat, a fortress that had withstood countless foes. Now it was to be his responsibility to uphold its legacy. Arya regarded the castle with equal curiosity. She had visited many parts of Westeros, but not Storm's End. The thick walls and the relentless sea appealed to something in her, an indomitable spirit of survival against the odds. They passed through the massive gates, and the garrison stood at attention, uncertain how to greet this new lord who had once been a low-born smith. Gendry dismounted, and Arya followed suit. The courtyard was slick with rain, and above them, banners bearing the crowned stag flapped in the gusty wind. A steward hurried forward, bowing politely, welcoming them to Storm's End. Gendry nodded, water streaming down his face, his posture steady despite the weather's fury. Some of the Stormland's minor lords and household knights gathered to greet them with wary courtesy. They bowed to their new lord and his northern lady, eyes darting with curiosity. Gendry set his jaw, raising a hand in greeting. He introduced Arya as his wife, Lady of Storm's End, forging a new alliance with the North. Arya's expression remained composed, her gaze sweeping across the gathering with a quiet confidence that belied any doubt they might harbor about her southern claims. Soon enough, they were ushered inside, where a large hearth provided some relief from the storm's chill. Servants offered towels to dry off and brought hot spiced wine. The steward guided Gendry and Arya through the torchlit corridors, pointing out various features of the ancient fortress. The stone hallways bore a stark simplicity. Storm's End had never been known for ornate decoration, favoring practicality and durability over ostentation. Arya, accustomed to the ruggedness of Winterfell, found a certain comfort in that. At last, they reached the Lord Solar, a chamber dominated by a massive oak table and a fireplace carved from dark stone. The windows looked out over the sea, where lightning occasionally lit the horizon. Gendry stood before the window, gazing out at the tumultuous waters. Arya joined him, following his line of sight. For a moment, they said nothing, letting the boom of distant thunder fill the space. "This place," Gendry said softly, "it feels alive with the storm." Arya nodded. "It's a fortress in constant battle with nature, it seems. Maybe it suits us more than we know." He turned to her, a half-smile on his face. "We'll make it ours, then, for however long we hold it." Arya studied his features, the flicker of lightning revealing the resolve in his eyes. "We will." And so they stood together, looking out at the raging sea as the storm crashed against the ancient walls of Storm's End, each silently vowing to stand firm in the face of whatever tempests the future might bring. They had forged a pact, Jon Snow's vision made real. Now it was up to them to see if this union of wolf and stag could endure the next trials that fate and Westeros would inevitably cast their way. The storms never truly ceased at Storm's End. Day after day, the winds howled around the battlements, and the sea hurled itself against the massive walls with relentless fury. In those first few weeks following their arrival, Arya often woke to the roar of the surf and the crash of rain upon the high windows, as though some ancient god raged outside. It didn't frighten her. If anything, she felt a sliver of kinship with a place so accustomed to turbulence. Gendry, too, seemed drawn to the tempestuous power of the Stormlands. He spent hours walking the ramparts, letting the wind whip through his hair, as if he were testing himself against the elements now under his care. The household of Storm's End quickly learned their new lord and lady were nothing like the lineage of Baratheons and the occasional Castellan who had previously ruled. Gendry's manners were far simpler, more direct, and he insisted on speaking with the castle's servants, blacksmiths, and guards without ceremony. He spent time in the armory, lending a hand where he could and asking questions about how the weapons were maintained. Though many found it strange to see a lord so hands-on, more than a few admired him for it, recalling the famous Robert Baratheon's more boisterous but equally unpretentious style. Arya, meanwhile, remained an enigma to the people. She did not linger in the Solar or the Lord's Hall but wandered the corridors and walls on her own terms. Sometimes, she trained with her sword in the courtyard, ignoring the curious stares of knights and guards. She occasionally joined Gendry in discussing practical matters of castle upkeep, supplies for the kitchens, the distribution of grain to the small folk, the state of the battlements, the readiness of the garrison. She had little patience for the finer points of southern courtesy, but she recognized the need to understand how the castle functioned. If she was going to live here, she wanted to know every inch of the walls and passageways, every soul who made the fortress run. The steward, a man named Harold Balling, served as their main guide to the daily affairs of Storm's End. He was perhaps in his 50s, lean from years of living in a place that demanded constant vigilance. His hair had gone mostly gray, and he walked with a slight limp, but his mind was sharp, and he spoke with the easy confidence of one who knew his domain intimately. Arya and Gendry called on him daily, seeking advice. With unwavering politeness, he explained the region's complexities. How the storms could ruin a harvest, the essential fishing villages along the coast, the storm's effect on trade ships. Each conversation built upon their understanding of this imposing seat. Some days, the rain subsided enough for them to ride out beyond the castle walls. Gendry wanted to see the surrounding lands, small hamlets that recognized Storm's End as their protector, farmland braced against the rocky soil, and rolling hills dotted with grazing sheep. More than once, he took Arya with him, a retinue of guards at their back, though she balked at the idea of too many attendants. Still, it was prudent. After all, the realm was more peaceful than it had been, but it was not without dangers. During one such ride, they stopped on a cliff overlooking the sea. The sky above roiled with leaden clouds, but no lightning forked through them that day. The wind tossed Arya's braid across her shoulder, and she squinted against the damp air. Beside her, Gendry reined in his horse, pointing down at a narrow beach. A handful of fishing boats were moored there, their sails furled. A small community of huts dotted the shoreline, the people going about their day under the watchful shadow of Storm's End, which loomed in the distance. "I want to help them," Gendry said quietly, his voice barely audible above the gust. "Harold says the storms have sometimes made their catches unpredictable, and last year's war demanded more fish than they could safely supply." Arya nodded. "We can see that they have better nets, perhaps, or a better arrangement for storing surplus, so it doesn't go to waste when the catches are good." Gendry shot her a grateful look. "Exactly. Maybe we can direct some of the castle's resources to strengthen the village." Arya pressed her lips together, thoughtful. "We should also check what Jon and the North might offer. Perhaps there's a trade that benefits both. The North has plenty of timber and stone. If we can send them to Storm's End, then the small folk here can build sturdier shelters. We could send salted fish north in return." Gendry's eyes lit with approval at her practical mindset. "That's a good idea." They dismounted and walked to the cliff's edge, leaving the guards behind at a respectful distance. The wind whipped at them, tugging at their cloaks, and salty spray rose from the crashing waves below. Gendry turned, scanning Arya's face for a moment. "Is it everything you expected?" he asked softly. "Being Lady of Storm's End?" She breathed in the charged air. "I never really had expectations of being Lady anywhere." Her gaze followed the horizon. "But the more I see, the more it reminds me that whether I claim to be a lady or not, these people depend on us now. And that's a responsibility I can't ignore." Gendry's expression grew thoughtful. "I know the burden weighs on you." Arya set her jaw, then shook her head. "I've learned to carry heavier burdens. This one doesn't frighten me. It's just strange." "I know," he murmured. "Thank you for helping me with it." The corners of her mouth turned upward, ever so slightly. "We're in it together, Gendry. That was the point, wasn't it?" He exhaled a small laugh, nodding. "Aye, it was." Their moment of soft companionship was interrupted by one of the guards clearing his throat behind them, informing them that darker clouds were rolling in and they should make for the castle before the rains grew heavier. They exchanged a glance, then mounted again and rode back. The journey up the winding path to Storm's End, buffeted by gusts of wind that carried the scent of oncoming rain, reminded Arya of the many roads she had traveled. This was but another twist in the path, albeit one that would require a different kind of resolve. By the time they returned, servants had prepared fresh clothes and hot tea in the solar, eager to warm their lord and lady from the raw chill of the outdoors. Arya appreciated the gesture but quickly changed into more practical attire, taking a seat by the fireplace, letting the dryness chase away the worst of the cold. Gendry joined her, sipping from a steaming cup, and they talked quietly about the small fishing village and what measures could be taken before winter set in. That evening, they held their first official audience in the Great Hall of Storm's End. Gendry sat in the high seat, carved from old oak, with Arya at his side. The hall was imposing, though less ostentatious than those in the south. The great columns rose toward a vaulted ceiling, and torches flickered along the walls, casting dancing shadows. Minor lords and knights, stewards and delegates filed in to present grievances or requests. It was a tradition as old as the castle itself. While Gendry listened, Arya studied the faces, searching for any hint of scorn or hidden agenda. In truth, many seemed simply curious. Lord Andrew Penrose, an older man whose family had long served as vassals to the Baratheons, stepped forward with a bow. He welcomed Gendry and Arya formally to the Stormlands, offered a gift of fine carved wood from his estate, and humbly asked if they might consider repairing an old watchtower that had been damaged during the war. Gendry promised to send a mason and some men to assess it. Arya, her eye for detail sharp, asked how far the watchtower was from the coast, so they could plan for possible naval threats. Penrose answered with a respectful thoroughness, impressed that the new lady took such an interest. Other petitions followed, a plea from a small village that needed more men-at-arms to fend off bandits, a complaint about a merchant who refused to pay certain port taxes, and a matter of contested land inheritance between two minor families. Gendry did not attempt to hide his inexperience. He listened intently, sometimes leaning toward Arya to ask her thoughts. She offered succinct observations. It felt odd to her to be consulted in such a structured environment, but she recognized the significance of her words to these people. As the audience wore on, the torches burned lower, and the queue of petitioners dwindled. Eventually, the steward signaled that the formal session was concluded. People bowed again, their footsteps echoing off the stone floor as they retreated. Gendry exhaled, leaning back in the high seat with a grimace of relief. "That wasn't so bad, was it?" Arya asked, half teasing. He shook his head, a small grin tugging at his lips. "No, just a lot to process. Now I understand why lords always had so many advisors." Arya considered the idea. At least the people here seem genuine. They aren't the same type of courtiers you'd find in King's Landing. He chuckled. "No, they're not. And I'd rather deal with straightforward folk than wade through the whisperings of King's Landing any day." They rose, stretching tired limbs, and made their way to the private quarters. The wind had picked up again, rattling the shutters. That night, they found their bedchamber window awash in rain. Lightning occasionally lit the sky, revealing the raging sea. The day's duties had left them both exhausted. They undressed quietly, slipping beneath the heavy furs for warmth. For a time, they lay side by side, listening to the torrent outside and each other's steady breathing. Arya stared at the ceiling. "We'll have to go back to Winterfell at some point," she said softly, her voice just audible above the storm. "Jon will want reports on how it's going, and I want to see Sansa and Bran again." Her tone betrayed a twinge of homesickness. Gendry turned toward her in the darkness, his gaze gentle. "We can arrange that. Once things here are steady, we'll make the journey north." She turned her head, her gray eyes meeting his in the flicker of distant lightning. "I'm not sure Storm's End will ever feel like home," she admitted, "but I'll do my best here." He reached out, resting a hand lightly over hers. "It can be what we make of it. And if we need to, we'll always have Winterfell." She nodded, comforted by the reassurance, though she couldn't quite put words to the feeling that she was perched between worlds. Sleep claimed them as the thunder boomed across the fortress, a lullaby of tumult that seemed fitting for their union. Days became weeks, and weeks turned into a couple of moons. Summer ebbed slowly toward the colder breezes that presaged a milder winter in the south, though it would still be fierce by local standards. Storm's End lived up to its name almost constantly, but life within its walls fell into a certain rhythm. Gendry worked diligently with Harold Bolling to finalize improvements to the fishing villages, as well as investigating potential trade routes with the north. Arya frequently patrolled the walls, sometimes with the guards, sometimes alone, learning every nook and cranny of the fortress. She oversaw the training of some of the younger soldiers, passing on bits of knowledge gleaned from her travels. Occasionally, she found herself thinking back to her days with the faceless men, the many faces she wore, the countless roles she played. Now she occupied the role of a lady and a wife, yet she found ways to subvert the constraints. She wore trousers beneath her cloak when she pleased, trained with a bow each morning, and if some of the older knights or staff disapproved, they kept their mutterings quiet. After all, she was as much a Stark as she was now a Baratheon, and her past in the wars had earned her a reputation that few dared question to her face. Her relationship with Gendry remained a partnership of respect and growing affection. They were not the starry-eyed couple some might have expected a newlywed pair to be, but there was an undeniable warmth when they were alone, a closeness forged by shared hardships and a mutual desire to protect each other. Sometimes she caught Gendry looking at her with an expression that reminded her of the boy he once was, the one who teased her about being highborn, who offered to travel with her as a family when she was scarcely more than a lost wolf pup. Those memories brought a faint smile to her lips. She wondered if he remembered them the same way. As autumn advanced, a raven arrived from Winterfell. It bore Sansa's elegant script, bringing news of the north. Jon had overseen negotiations with several lords who once doubted the unity of the realm, but tensions seemed to be easing. Bran spent more time in the Godswood, though Sansa wrote that he occasionally mentioned events far beyond the north, as if he saw them through some mysterious lens. The letter ended with a gentle nudge. She hoped that Arya and Gendry would consider visiting soon, if their duties allowed. Arya's heart lifted at the idea. She showed the letter to Gendry, who considered it thoughtfully. "We could arrange the journey," he said. "Leave Harold in charge for a time, along with a small council of local lords to handle daily tasks. It might do us good to see how the north fares and reaffirm our ties. Besides, I want to talk to Jon about a few things regarding trade." Arya nodded, remembering how much she missed her siblings. "Let's go, then." They began preparations, though it took time to organize everything so the fortress would function in their absence. Gendry insisted that the Stormlands remain secure, that the local lords continue to see progress in the projects they'd begun. Arya oversaw the provisioning for the journey. She made sure they traveled lightly, wary of the burdensome retinues that sometimes accompanied highborn travelers. Still, they couldn't be too careless. As a lord and lady, they needed enough guards and attendants to ensure safety and convey proper standing. On the morning they set out, the sun rose amid dark clouds, a typical Storm's End farewell. Rain pelted the courtyard as the group assembled. Arya wore her riding leathers and a thick wool cloak to keep out the chill. Needle hung at her hip as always. Gendry wore a sturdy black cloak lined with fur, the stag of House Baratheon embroidered on the left breast. The gates rumbled open, revealing a slate-gray sky and rolling sheets of rain. They rode forth, accompanied by a small column of knights, a few household guards, and a wagon carrying supplies. The road north was familiar yet always changing with the seasons. Rain gave way to clear skies some days, allowing them to make decent progress. On other days, storms slowed them, forcing them to huddle in inns or the halls of lesser lords who offered hospitality. They received varied receptions. Some were eager to show respect to the new Lord and Lady Baratheon, while others simply marveled at seeing a Stark among them. Yet no matter where they stopped, they found people generally more at ease than they had been in the time of war. The peace brokered by King Bran the Broken, so the Whispers called him, and enforced by the alliances in the realm had held. For now, at least, Arya couldn't help but notice how Gendry carried himself now. Slightly straighter in the saddle, more comfortable addressing minor lords in a measured, confident tone. He would never be a polished courtier, but he'd embraced the role of leadership in his own way. She felt a quiet pride in that, remembering the boy he once was. He'd been tested by forging, war, and the demands of his newfound position, and he had emerged stronger. In turn, Gendry observed how Arya managed the guards and the daily details of the journey. She possessed a keen eye for strategy, an ability to read people swiftly. When a minor dispute arose between two guards, she settled it with a few sharp words that brooked no argument. If Gendry was the open, approachable leader, Arya was the watchful sentinel, ensuring that no problem festered out of sight. They crossed the tranquil fields of the Reach, picking safe roads that angled northeast. The farmland slowly gave way to rougher terrain, the air growing colder. When they finally reached the Neck, the boundary of the north, the chill winds were no longer the mild breezes of the south but sharp reminders that winter would soon come in earnest. Arya breathed deeply of that northern air, feeling a pang of emotion at the familiarity of it. The smell of pine and distant peat fires reminded her of a place she had never truly left in her heart. Riding into the north was both a homecoming and a mission. The forests thickened around them, the days shortened noticeably, and the nights demanded heavier furs. They passed through a few northern holdfasts, where bearded men and tough-faced women recognized the Stark banner and greeted them with hearty respect. As rumors spread that Arya Stark and Gendry Baratheon were traveling north, small gatherings of curious folk appeared at crossroads, waving or simply staring in awe at the couple who had once fought in the Great War. At last, Winterfell's walls rose before them. The castle stood steadfast beneath a sky that threatened snow. Smoke curled from the chimneys, and the banners of House Stark flew proudly at the battlements. Arya's heart quickened at the sight. Memories poured in. Chasing cats along the walls, dueling with a wooden sword in the yard, listening to her father's voice echo in these halls. She turned to Gendry, who offered her a faint, understanding smile, and she nodded once in silent thanks. This was her home, and now, somehow, it was his as well, by bond if not by blood. The gates swung open. They entered the courtyard amid a swirl of activity. Stable hands rushed to take their horses, and guards saluted. Sansa emerged at the top of the steps leading into the great keep, dressed in a thick fur-lined gown, her hair woven in the northern style. A small retinue of servants trailed behind her. When Arya dismounted, Sansa hurried forward, greeting her with an embrace that belied the formal distance she sometimes showed. Arya returned the hug with equal fervor, a rare display of sisterly warmth. "You've made good time," Sansa said, stepping back to study both Arya and Gendry. "You look well, both of you." Arya nodded. "The storms haven't drowned us yet, and it's good to be back in the north." Gendry bowed his head respectfully. "Lady Sansa, it's good to see you again." He used her formal title, but his smile was genuine. Sansa smiled in return, linking arms with Arya as she guided them inside. "Come in. Jon will be back soon. He's been out inspecting some of the holdfasts, ensuring they're prepared for winter. Bran is in the Godswood, I believe. And the rest of our guests, well, we've had a few visitors you'll want to see." Curiosity piqued Arya's brow. "Visitors?" Sansa cast her a cryptic smile. "You'll see soon enough." Inside, the warmth of Winterfell enveloped them. Servants moved quickly to store their belongings and show their guards to temporary quarters. Another servant hurried forward with cups of hot mulled wine, pressing them into Arya and Gendry's hands. Sansa led them through familiar corridors. The stone walls that once seemed so large to Arya now felt almost comforting in their simplicity. She caught Gendry glancing around, perhaps noting the differences in architecture compared to Storm's End or simply recalling the days he spent here forging weapons against the long night. They passed through the great hall, its hearth roaring, and climbed the steps to the Lord's Solar. Sansa pushed open the heavy door, revealing a room lit by afternoon light streaming through tall windows. Bran sat in his chair near the table, gazing at them with that distant half-smile that still unsettled many. Opposite him, sipping tea with measured grace, was Brienne of Tarth, dressed in a simple gown rather than her usual armor. Her face lit up at the sight of Arya and Gendry. "Sir Brienne," Arya said, a rare grin tugging at her lips. She moved forward to clasp the taller woman's hand. "I didn't expect to see you here." Brienne rose to greet her. "I've been traveling on behalf of King Bran, delivering messages to some of the more remote lords. After that, I came north to consult with Lady Sansa about trade arrangements, and to see how Winterfell fares." Arya glanced at Gendry, knowing how grateful he once was to Brienne for any part she played in protecting them during the wars. Gendry gave the knight a respectful nod, and Brienne returned it, her blue eyes warm. Her gaze flicked to Arya's sword at her hip. "You still wear needle, I see." Arya smirked. "Always." Brienne nodded approvingly, then turned to Gendry. "And how does Storm's End treat you, my lord?" He shrugged with a wry chuckle. "The storms treat me like a trespasser some days, but the people are good." Bran's quiet voice drew their attention. "You belong there more than you know," he said, tone mild yet somehow laden with that omniscient quality he possessed. "But I'm pleased you've come back to the north. We have matters to discuss." Sansa gestured for them all to be seated around the fire. Arya lowered herself onto a bench, while Gendry took a seat beside her. A servant poured more tea, and Sansa dismissed the rest of the attendants with a graceful wave. Once the door closed, she turned to Arya and Gendry, her expression shifting to something more earnest. "Jon's new approach to forging alliances has gone smoothly," Sansa began. "But there are murmurs that not all is well in certain corners of Westeros. Some who once supported Cersei, or who resent the new order, might be stirring up dissent." Brienne nodded in agreement. "On my travels, I've heard faint rumors of small gatherings of discontented lords. Nothing overt, but enough that we should keep watch." Arya's gaze narrowed. "Are they planning a rebellion?" Sansa lifted a hand in a calming gesture. "There's no sign of anything large-scale, but they might try to rally around any perceived weaknesses. The union of House Stark and House Baratheon has been a major stabilizing force. Some might resent that, see it as undue power concentrated between North and Stormlands." Gendry sighed, recalling the complexities of southern politics. "So they think we've grown too strong together." Bran's eyes seemed to focus on something far away. "The realm is a tapestry constantly being rewoven. Some threads will resist the new pattern." His voice dropped into a musing tone that made it unclear whether he was speaking metaphorically or literally seeing visions of the future. "It's not inevitable, but you should be vigilant." Arya felt a flutter of excitement mixed with concern. She'd never been the type to shy away from confrontation, but she did not relish the idea of Westeros plunging into another war. "So what do we do?" Sansa leaned forward. "For now, we keep our alliances strong. We watch for signs of unrest. We remind those who question our unity that we stand together, north and south alike. And if needed, we move quickly to quell any uprising before it spreads." A silence settled over them, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Brienne's face was stoic, and Gendry's jaw tensed slightly. Arya studied each of them. So this was the heart of leadership after the wars, the constant vigilance, the unending negotiations to keep a fragile peace. "On a lighter note," Sansa added, voice softening, "I'm glad you're both here. We can use this time to celebrate your union properly in the north. You deserve at least some joy after everything." Arya shrugged. "We had a wedding feast." "I'm sure you did," Sansa replied, a twinkle in her eye. "But you're still a Stark, and the northern lords want to see for themselves how well you've settled in. A feast in your honor, both of you, will help reinforce the bond." Gendry offered a wry grin. "We won't say no. Storm's End is too damp to hold a grand feast without half the guests catching cold." Bran's gaze returned from distant thoughts. You should rest from your journey. There will be time for plans and feasts soon enough." They agreed, rising and exchanging farewells. Arya squeezed Brienne's arm in gratitude for her service and support. Gendry bowed respectfully to Bran. Then Sansa led them down the corridor to the chambers prepared for them. They were rooms Arya remembered from her youth, once used by visiting dignitaries or sometimes distant relatives. The thick walls and heavy drapes kept out the worst of the cold. A warm brazier glowed in the corner, and the bed was piled high with furs. Once the door closed, Arya let out a slow breath, surveying the familiar space. Gendry set their packs aside and ran a hand over the soft fur on the bed. Outside, the sky grew darker with late afternoon's approach, and they could already smell the sense of roasting meat drifting from the kitchens below. "It's strange being here like this," Arya remarked, pulling off her gloves. "Last time I came back to Winterfell, it was in the midst of war, and everything felt uncertain." Gendry nodded, recalling how chaotic those days had been. "Now, at least it's a homecoming in peace, though it seems there are always rumblings of new conflicts." She turned to face him, hands on her hips, a slight frown playing on her lips. "We'll deal with them if they arise, but I won't let the threat of trouble overshadow being here with my family." He offered a gentle smile and closed the distance between them, resting a hand on her shoulder. "We won't." She glanced at the door, then at him. Even though they were married, there was a reflexive sense of needing privacy. She'd never been one for public displays. But now, in the quiet of this chamber, with only the distant bustle of the castle beyond the walls, she leaned in and rested her forehead against his chin. A soft closeness passed between them, wordless and warm. "How long do you think we'll stay?" Gendry asked softly. "As long as we're needed," Arya replied. "A few weeks, perhaps. Or more, if things get complicated." He nodded, sliding his arms around her in a loose embrace. "I'd like to see how they run the forges here now, if they've kept any of the improvements from the war days." Arya smirked. "Of course you do." He huffed a short laugh. "A man can't forget his trade, even if they call me Lord." The corners of her mouth curved upward. This was them, forged by experiences neither had sought, thrust into roles they might never have imagined, but making the most of it all the same. They separated when a knock sounded at the door. A servant entered, bowing low, to inform them that supper would be served in 2 hours, and Lady Sansa invited them to the small dining hall for a private family meal before they made any grand appearances in the great hall. Arya nodded her thanks, dismissing the servant. She turned back to Gendry and rolled her eyes good-naturedly. "Family dinners," she said with a rueful smile. "We used to have them when I was a child. It was always a struggle for me not to sneak food to the direwolves or slip away from the table early. I wonder how different it is now." Gendry shrugged, setting aside his cloak. "We'll find out soon enough. Let's get settled." They took a short respite, washing away the dust of travel and changing into fresh clothes. Arya opted for a simple gray tunic with stark embroidery at the collar and sturdy leggings beneath a dark skirt, an outfit that balanced practicality with a nod to northern courtesy. Gendry wore a dark doublet trimmed with fur, the crest of a black stag on one sleeve and the stark direwolf on the other, symbolizing their union. Then, together, they left the room, descending the familiar corridors toward the smaller dining hall, once used by the Stark family for more intimate meals. Warm torchlight flickered along the walls, and the scent of roasted vegetables and spiced venison filled the air. They entered to find Sansa at the head of the table, Bran in his wheeled chair to her right, and a seat left open for Jon beside her. Brienne stood off to the side, quietly conferring with a guard. When she saw Arya and Gendry, she gave them a nod and made her way to the opposite end of the hall, standing discreetly though she might continue to fulfill her protective duties. Arya's gaze flicked around. "Where's Jon?" Sansa smiled. "He just returned. He'll be here shortly." They moved toward the table. Bran tilted his head in greeting. "Arya, Gendry, I'm glad we have a moment of peace to talk." Arya looked at him, recalling the wide-eyed boy he had once been. He was so different now, calmer, more detached from the mundane. yet there was kindness behind his far-seeing eyes. She rested a hand on the back of Bran's chair. "It's good to see you, Bran." He studied her for a moment, as if wanting to say more, but then the sound of footsteps approached. Jon Snow strode in, his cloak speckled with melting snowflakes, a slight flush on his cheeks from the cold outside. His eyes lit up at the sight of Arya, and he quickly closed the distance, pulling her into a fierce hug. "You made it," he said, voice rough with emotion. "I've been hearing about your journey for days." Arya hugged him back just as tightly, exhaling a quiet relief. "It's good to see you, Jon." He stepped back, turned to Gendry, and clasped the man's forearm with a warm smile. "You look well, my friend." Gendry inclined his head. "The North suits me better than King's Landing ever did." "You look good too, Jon." Jon's expression took on a hint of self-deprecation. Responsibility will do that to a man, or maybe it just weathers him. He cast Sansa an amused look. "Shall we eat before it gets cold?" They took their seats with Sansa at the head, Bran to her right, Jon to her left, and Arya and Gendry side by side across from Bran. Brienne quietly slipped out, trusting that the king in the north and the Lady of Winterfell were well guarded. Servants began to bring out dishes: roast venison, hearty stews, fresh-baked bread. Arya felt a wave of nostalgia at the sight of northern fare. Conversation flowed more freely than she expected. Jon spoke of how the smaller northern lords were preparing for winter, storing grain, ensuring roads were passable for trade, and cooperating with each other far more than they had in the past. Sansa added details about the improvements they'd enacted: new storehouses, better alliances with the Vale, and a push for more consistent communication across the region. Gendry talked about Storm's End, describing the fishing communities and the challenges of constant storms. Jon listened intently, occasionally interjecting with questions or suggestions. Sansa then reminded them of her plan for some form of festivity, an official welcome to celebrate Arya and Gendry's union. Arya tried to mask her reluctance. She wasn't one for grand ceremonies, but recognized the necessity. Jon caught the subtle shift in Arya's mood. He reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand on hers. "Don't worry, this feast isn't going to be like King's Landing. We'll keep it a northern affair." She smiled in gratitude, and the talk turned to simpler things: the state of the hunts in the nearby forests, the possibility of sending a delegation to the Iron Islands, the daily routines of the castle. All the while, Bran observed them with an unreadable expression, occasionally offering a comment that felt like a puzzle piece dropping into place. Arya noticed how seamlessly Sansa handled the dinner, guiding the conversation when needed, letting others speak when it was time. She had become, in many ways, the true Lady of Winterfell, ensuring stability in a land once torn apart by tragedy. When the meal ended, they lingered around the table, sipping hot spiced wine. Arya found herself relaxing into the familiarity of her siblings' presence. She leaned back in her chair, watching Gendry and Jon trade stories of their time traveling together, forging dragonglass weapons and preparing for the war against the dead. Sansa listened with a soft smile, contributing details about the behind-the-scenes logistics. Bran listened, his eyes distant yet somehow focused, as though he remembered everything in perfect clarity and appreciated the retelling on a different level. At length, Sansa suggested they all retire, as it had been a long day, but Jon asked Arya to stay behind a moment. When the others excused themselves, she and Jon remained in the hall, the hearth's flames dancing shadows along the walls. Arya arched an eyebrow, curious about what he wanted to discuss in private. Jon waited until the servants were fully gone, then turned to her. "How are you?" he asked softly, his concern plain. She tilted her head, a small, wry smile on her lips. "Well enough. And you?" He gave a low chuckle. "I'm doing all right. But I worry about you, Arya. I know what it's like to be bound to a duty you never sought." Arya shrugged. "I married Gendry out of duty, yes, but it's not the same as everything that happened with you. Finding out your parents, your claim." She lowered her voice. "Or what you sacrificed." Jon looked away for a moment, as though recalling ghosts of the past. Then he turned back to her. Still, if there's anything you need, if you ever feel trapped or unhappy, know that you have a home here, always." Her expression softened. She reached out and squeezed his hand. "Thank you, Jon. Truly. But I'm not unhappy. It's just a different path than I imagined. Gendry is good. We're learning how to be what the realm needs us to be, and maybe that can be what we need, too." Jon nodded, relief mingling with understanding. "Good. Then I won't pry further. I just wanted you to know you're not alone in all this." A gentle silence settled, and Arya smiled. "I know," she said simply. "Rest well, Jon." They parted with a hug. Arya made her way back to the chamber she shared with Gendry, the corridor lit by flickering torches. Thoughts churned in her mind as she recalled Jon's words. She appreciated his concern, but there was a complexity to her life she couldn't fully articulate. She was Arya Stark, wife to Gendry Baratheon, Lady of Storm's End, a traveler who had once worn many faces. Trying to merge all those identities was a task that would take time. When she entered their chamber, Gendry was already there, removing his boots by the fire. He glanced up, noticing the thoughtful look on her face. "Everything all right?" he asked. She nodded, shrugging off her cloak. "Just Jon being Jon," she replied with a faint smile. "Worrying over me like I'm still that little girl chasing cats." His eyes crinkled with amusement. "He cares about you. That's not a bad thing." "I know." They settled in for the night, the warmth of the fire easing the northern chill. Outside the window, a soft wind rustled the trees of the Godswood. Arya thought she could almost hear the ancient branches call her name, beckoning her to visit. Perhaps she would go tomorrow. For now, she closed her eyes, letting the day's events melt away into the welcome darkness of dreamless sleep. The following morning dawned gray and cold, a smattering of snow swirling in the courtyard. Arya rose early, dressing in warm leathers, and quietly left the chamber while Gendry still slept. She navigated the corridors with familiar ease, heading for the Godswood. She wanted a moment alone before the bustle of the day claimed her. The Godswood of Winterfell had always been a sanctuary to House Stark, a place where the old gods watched from the ancient weirwood's carved face. She found it much the same, though the hush felt even deeper now. Snow dusted the ground, and the red leaves of the weirwood shivered in a gentle breeze. The eyes carved into the white bark stared at her, as though seeing through every mask she had ever worn. Arya approached slowly, feeling the crunch of snow under her boots. She knelt before the heart tree, hands resting on her thighs, letting the silence wrap around her like a cloak. She felt the pull of memory, her father's voice, the lessons of her youth, the illusions and transformations she had undergone in Bravos. For a moment, she closed her eyes, trying to reconcile all the faces she had worn into one cohesive sense of self. She wasn't sure how long she remained in that stillness, but eventually, she sensed another presence. Opening her eyes, she saw Bran's chair a short distance away, wheels leaving faint tracks in the light snow. He observed her calmly, his breath misting in the cold air. "You've come home," Bran said softly, his voice carrying with an otherworldly calm. Arya nodded, rising to her feet. "For now." Bran looked up at the weirwood, his expression inscrutable. "So many threads lead back here. Sometimes I see them converging, sometimes splintering. Yet you always seem to find your way home, no matter the path." Arya folded her arms. "Because I'm a Stark." He smiled faintly. "Yes, you are. And you're more than that, too. You carry the skills of a faceless man, the experiences of a traveler, the cunning of a survivor. You are not confined to any single role." Arya studied him, aware that he spoke not just as her brother but as the three-eyed raven. "Have you seen something? About me or Gendry?" Bran's gaze drifted as if focusing on some invisible tapestry. "Possibilities. Some futures are clearer than others. Storm's End was once sworn to House Targaryen, a long time ago. Now it stands with House Stark through you. The realm's shape is never fixed." Arya took a deep breath. "Is there danger?" Bran paused a moment, then shook his head. Not immediate, but the seeds of discontent can grow quickly. Remember that if unrest stirs, it often hides in the shadows until it's strong enough to strike. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze. We're ready. Bran studied her intently, then wheeled closer. You found a balance in your marriage, Arya. It may not have been born of romance, but it holds its own strength. That bond might prove crucial. A flicker of discomfort passed over her features. She wasn't used to discussing such personal matters with Bran, but she managed a nod. I think so too. He laid a hand lightly on hers. I'm glad you're here. Jon is too, and Sansa. We're better when we stand together, as Father always said. Arya squeezed his hand gently, then let go. A cold gust swept through the godswood, rustling the leaves, and they both turned to look up at the carved face in the weirwood. In the hush, Arya felt a profound sense of belonging, a reminder that no matter where she traveled, some part of her soul was rooted in this ancient northern soil. Bran eventually steered his chair away, leaving her to her thoughts once more. She lingered a little longer, then returned to the castle. The morning's chores and meetings awaited her. She found Gendry already up and dressed, speaking with Jon in a small chamber off the main hall, where maps were spread out over a table. They were discussing trade routes between Storm's End and White Harbor, looking for ways to streamline shipments of grain and fish. Arya joined them, listening as Jon pointed out hazards along the coast. Hidden reefs, unpredictable currents. It might be better to send goods overland for part of the journey, Jon concluded. We can have them transported by wagon to a safer port north of Crackclaw Point, then load them onto ships for the rest of the way. Gendry nodded thoughtfully. That could work. It'd require building or improving roads, but it might save us from losing ships to the storms. Arya studied the map, running a finger along the coastline. Pirates might also be an issue in some of these waters. Even if the war is over, lawless men still roam. Jon sighed. True. That's why we need a consistent naval patrol. But that's where the crown's resources come into play. The king can delegate some of the royal fleet. A knock at the door interrupted them. Sansa entered, graceful as ever. Arya, Gendry, we need your input on the feast preparations. The lords are arriving in a few days, and they're quite excited to pay their respects. Arya arched an eyebrow. Lords from all over the north? Sansa nodded. Yes, and a few from the Trident as well. Those who value our alliances and want to see how Storm's End might fit into their trade plans. This is an opportunity to show them we stand united. Gendry exchanged a look with Arya, then gave Sansa a polite smile. We'll do whatever is required. Just tell us where to be and when. Excellent, Sansa said, clearly relieved at their cooperation. I've arranged for the feast to be held in 2 nights' time. It won't be as large as a royal wedding, but it will be grand enough for our purposes. She turned to Arya. There will be music, dancing, and the usual courtesies. I know that's not your favorite, but it's important. Arya exhaled. Understood. Sansa moved closer, setting a gentle hand on Arya's shoulder. I promise not to lace you into any southern monstrosity of a gown. I'll keep it simple, but you should at least wear something that shows your status. Arya shrugged, half amused, half resigned. Fine. If it helps unify the realm, I'll wear a pretty dress and smile at the lords. Jon grinned at her, warmth in his eyes. You'll be fine. Think of it as a test of patience, like waiting in ambush. Arya snorted at the analogy, though it wasn't entirely inaccurate. The 4 of them wrapped up the discussion, mapping out duties for the days ahead. Jon and Gendry would finalize trade matters and greet the visiting lords, while Arya and Sansa coordinated the finer points of the feast's arrangements. Music, seating, the handling of any delicate tensions that might arise between guests. The days flew by in a rush of activity. Servants decorated the great hall with fresh greenery and the occasional southern floral arrangement for color. Kitchens bustled with the sounds of chopping, stirring, and the sizzling of meats. Barrels of ale and wine were rolled in, and a small selection of sweet Dornish wines arrived in crates bearing sigils of alliance. Sansa personally oversaw the table placements, ensuring that no two rival lords sat within insult-hurling distance. Arya occasionally slipped away from these tasks, checking the training yard or the stables, but Sansa invariably hunted her down to finalize some detail. When the night of the feast arrived, Winterfell stirred with a collected energy reminiscent of times long past. Lords and ladies gathered in the courtyard, shaking off the winter chill, greeting one another with polite bows and measured words. The great hall glowed with torchlight and the heat of several large hearths, the aroma of roasted boar and spiced potatoes wafting through the air. Musicians tuned their instruments in one corner, preparing to play lively northern ballads. Arya stood in her chamber, adjusting the skirts of a dark gray gown that Sansa had picked out for her. It was made of wool warm enough for the north, with subtle embroidery of direwolves along the hem. Her hair was braided intricately, courtesy of a patient handmaiden. She sighed, turning to Gendry, who wore a high-collared black doublet trimmed with fur and emblazoned with both the Stag of Baratheon and the Wolf of Stark on opposite shoulders. "You look the part," he teased softly. "A lady of the north." She gave him a mock glare. "Don't get used to it." He laughed under his breath, offering her his arm. "Shall we, my lady?" Rolling her eyes, she looped her arm through his, and they made their way to the great hall. The clamor of voices grew louder as they approached. At the entrance, 2 guards pushed open the heavy wooden doors, revealing a scene of organized chaos. Lords greeting one another, servants weaving between tables with trays laden with cups, and flames dancing in the hearths. Jon and Sansa stood near the high table, greeting each guest. Bran was already seated in a place of honor. As Arya and Gendry entered, a hush spread across the crowd, then a respectful murmur rippled through. Many bowed or curtsied in their direction. Arya felt a rush of self-consciousness but lifted her chin, determined to project confidence. They advanced to join Jon and Sansa. Jon smiled broadly, and Sansa gave Arya a proud nod as she announced, "Lord Gendry Baratheon of Storm's End and Lady Arya Stark, his wife and our sister, welcome you all to Winterfell." Polite applause followed, and Arya could see several northern lords exchanging glances as if to say, "So that's the Lady of Storm's End." She recognized a few faces: Lord Glover, Lady Mormont's cousin who now held Bear Island, some lesser-known Karstarks, and a handful of Riverland's lords she only vaguely recalled. They seemed genuinely pleased to see her. She remembered how the North had come together under Jon's banner to fight for survival, and the old sense of camaraderie sparked in her chest. The feast commenced. The high table was piled with an abundance of dishes: roasted fowl, venison stew, root vegetables in fragrant sauces, fresh bread, and a variety of tarts and pies for dessert. Minstrels played tunes that ranged from lively jigs to solemn ballads celebrating the heroics of the long night. Jon opened the evening with a toast, welcoming all lords and acknowledging the alliances that had preserved peace. He proposed a special tribute to the memory of all who had fallen in the wars, and the hall echoed with raised cups and solemn nods. As they ate, Arya found herself engaged in polite conversation with Lord Glover, who politely inquired about her life in the Stormlands. She responded with brief yet honest answers, emphasizing the resilience of the people there. Gendry jumped in occasionally, discussing improvements to the harbor and praising Arya's keen sense of defense. Though the conversation was cordial, she could sense the underlying curiosity. Some wondered how a Stark of Winterfell adapted to the storms of the Baratheon seat. Further down the table, Sansa conversed gracefully with a Riverlands envoy, and Jon listened intently to a trio of minor lords who proposed expanded trade with White Harbor. Bran sat quietly, occasionally interjecting with a seemingly random comment that somehow fit the discussion perfectly. Servants refilled cups with wine and ale, and the atmosphere slowly shifted from formal caution to a more relaxed camaraderie. Laughter broke out at various tables. Old acquaintances reunited. New trade deals were tentatively proposed in hushed conversations. When the minstrels struck up a more spirited tune, some guests made their way to the open space near the hearth for dancing. Northern dancing was robust and hearty, far less intricate than the courtly dances of King's Landing. People spun around in lively circles, their faces flushed with warmth and drink. Sansa led the way in the first dance, partnered by a young lord from the Vale, while Jon found himself persuaded by an eager lady from House Serwyn. Gendry turned to Arya, arching an eyebrow. "Do you dance?" he asked, half challenging, half curious. Arya eyed the swirling couples. "It's not exactly Braavosi water dancing, is it?" he chuckled. "Still, we could try, unless you'd rather avoid it altogether." She narrowed her eyes mischievously. "Come on, Baratheon. Let's see if you can keep up." She rose, taking his hand, and led him to the open floor. The music was quick, and the dance steps required enthusiastic energy rather than dainty elegance. Arya moved deftly, her reflexes honed by years of sword work, and Gendry followed, relying on his natural vigor. They spun among the other dancers, occasionally bumping shoulders or stepping on toes, then laughing it off. The lords and ladies nearby looked on with a mixture of amusement and relief. Seeing the Lady of Storm's End and her husband join in so openly broke some of the stiff formality. As the dance continued, Arya felt a surge of unaccustomed joy. Her cheeks flushed from exertion, her braided hair swinging behind her as she twirled. Gendry's grin was wide and carefree, and she remembered the times they joked and bantered in camp during the war. This was a far cry from those desperate days of forging dragonglass weapons or huddling behind battlements, but the spark of camaraderie was the same. When the music ended, they broke apart, breathing hard, sharing a laugh. Applause rippled through the onlookers, and even Sansa, stepping off the dance floor, gave Arya an approving nod. Arya guided Gendry back to the table, grabbing a cup of cool ale to quench her thirst. She could feel an unfamiliar lightness in her chest, something close to genuine contentment. "I didn't trip too many times, did I?" Gendry asked, catching his breath. Arya smirked, wiping a bead of sweat from her brow. "You did fine. Better than I expected." He chuckled. "You're full of surprises. You know that?" Her eyes sparkled. "So are you." Their moment was interrupted by Lord Umber, an older man who had survived the wars, now leading a much-reduced House Umber, coming forward to offer them a toast. He praised the alliance between House Stark and House Baratheon, reminding everyone of the old friendship between Eddard Stark and Robert Baratheon. Arya felt a tug of sadness at the memory of her father and Robert, but also a sense of pride that she and Gendry carried on some echo of that bond. The rest of the night unfolded in a swirl of conversation, more dancing, and a steady stream of food and drink. Arya spotted Tormund Giantsbane in attendance, regaling a group of northern warriors with wild tales from beyond the wall. She recalled that Tormund sometimes visited Winterfell, drawn by a fondness for Jon and a curiosity about the realm he once saw only as an enemy's land. Near midnight, after many of the older lords had drifted off to their chambers or collapsed in quiet corners, Arya and Gendry slipped away. They left the great hall, stepping into the cold night air in the courtyard. Snow drifted lazily, reflecting moonlight. The chill felt refreshing after the warmth and noise inside. Gendry rubbed his hands together. "One thing I miss about Storm's End. It's cold there, but not like this." Arya shrugged. "I grew up in this cold. It's comforting in a way." They wandered the courtyard, passing silent battlements. Guards stood watch, offering respectful nods. Eventually, they found themselves near the spot where Arya used to practice archery as a child. Lantern light from a nearby sconce illuminated the targets, now covered in a thin layer of frost. Arya paused, her breath visible in the icy air. "I used to stand right here," she said quietly, touching the edge of a broken wooden post, "shooting arrows until my fingers went numb. Sometimes Jon would show me a better stance." Gendry listened, sensing the memories flowing through her. He rested a hand on her shoulder. "I wish I could have seen that." She turned to face him, meeting his gaze under the moonlight. "You've seen me do plenty of dangerous things." He smiled. "And you'll probably do more." A comfortable hush fell between them. The feast had been a testament to their alliance, but also to a blossoming sense of partnership beyond duty. They were forging something, like steel in a smith's forge, hammered by circumstance, shaped by mutual respect, and tempered by affection. It was not the grand love story of legends, but it was real in its own way. They heard footsteps crunching in the snow. Jon approached, cloak pulled tight. He glanced at the half-frozen targets, then at Arya and Gendry. "Escaping the feast?" he asked, smiling. Arya shrugged. "Just needed some air." Jon nodded, looking from one to the other with quiet satisfaction. "I'm glad you came back, both of you. The North feels more complete with you here." They shared a reflective silence under the moon's glow. In that moment, a sense of unity settled over them. Three people who had survived horrors beyond imagining, now standing together in a courtyard once filled with the laughter of their childhood. The future still held uncertainties, threats lurking at the corners of Westeros. But for now, they had this moment of calm and the knowledge that they would face whatever came together. Eventually, Jon bade them good night, returning to the castle. Arya and Gendry lingered a little longer, gazing at the snowy yard. When they finally turned to leave, their hands brushed, and Arya slipped her fingers through his. Neither spoke, but the warmth of that simple gesture was enough. Step by step, they walked back inside, where Winterfell's comforting halls enfolded them. In the days after the feast, business resumed. Some lords lingered at Winterfell to finalize trade agreements or discuss military readiness for the northern roads in winter. Jon convened councils to address these matters, with Sansa presiding over many of the sessions. Arya and Gendry participated, but they also took time for themselves. They ventured beyond the walls of Winterfell, riding across snow-covered fields, visiting outlying farms and holdfasts to see how the small folk prepared for the cold months. During one such ride, they stopped by a frozen pond near a small village. Children were sliding on the ice, shrieking with laughter. Arya and Gendry watched from a distance, horses stamping in the snow. A memory surfaced for Arya. Once upon a time, she had slid on ice with Bran and Rickon, ignoring Sansa's admonitions that it was unladylike. The pang of nostalgia was bittersweet, reminding her of those who were gone and the innocence she had lost. Gendry seemed to sense her thoughts. He reached over, touching her arm. "They look happy," he remarked, his breath misting in the cold. She nodded. "They do. I hope they stay that way." One of the children noticed them and hurried over, bowing clumsily in the snow upon recognizing a Stark. The others soon followed, eyes wide with a mixture of awe and curiosity. Arya dismounted, crouching to speak with them. They asked if she was truly a lady, if she was the same Arya Stark who once fought alongside the Hound, if it was true she could beat any man in a sword fight. She answered with humor and brevity, though she omitted the darkest parts of her story. Gendry joined, offering the children a warm smile, letting them marvel at the idea that a blacksmith could become a lord. That evening, back in Winterfell, they dined quietly with Jon and Sansa in a smaller room. Only a few attendants were present, the mood relaxed. Jon mentioned that more lords had departed, leaving only a handful who still needed to settle minor disputes. Sansa praised the success of the feast, which had garnered goodwill across the north. Arya felt relief. She hadn't relished the idea of more ceremonies. As they spoke, Gendry cleared his throat. "We should probably return to Storm's End soon. I don't want to leave Harold Bolling in charge for too long without us, especially if there's any sign of trouble brewing." Jon and Sansa exchanged looks. Sansa nodded. "Yes, I understand, but stay a little longer if you can, at least until the last of the lords leave Winterfell. We might also have some updates from King's Landing soon." Arya raised an eyebrow. "From the Crown?" Jon leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Davos sends word that the king is in discussion with the master of ships about reorganizing patrols off the coast. That could impact Storm's End as well as ports in the north. If we wait a few more days, we might have more clarity." Gendry agreed. "Then we'll wait. Better to travel south with solid information than rely on guesswork." Plans settled, they moved on to lighter topics. Sansa asked Gendry about the architecture of Storm's End, curious how it compared to Winterfell. He did his best to describe the thick walls and the fortress's unique shape. Arya contributed small anecdotes from her time exploring the castle. Jon listened, occasionally asking questions or adding a wry comment about the difference between northern stone and southern storms. Later, as they walked back to their chamber, Arya observed the familiarity of these halls. She had known them all her life, left them for a journey full of darkness and peril, and returned to find them changed yet still a source of comfort. Now she was poised between two homes, Winterfell and Storm's End, carrying a piece of both inside her. In bed that night, she lay awake for a time, watching the play of moonlight on the ceiling. Gendry slept quietly beside her, worn from the day's activities. She thought about the future, the rumors of unrest, the question of how best to rule Storm's End alongside Gendry, and the ever-present sense that Westeros, for all its calm, could erupt at any moment. Yet for now they had peace. She breathed in the cold northern air and let her eyes drift shut. Morning broke clearer than usual, the sky an expanse of pale blue as the sun crested the eastern horizon. Arya rose early and slipped outside, drawn by a desire to see the castle grounds in the crisp light. She was halfway across the courtyard when she heard someone call her name. Turning, she saw Brienne of Tarth striding toward her, her armor gleaming faintly in the winter sun. "Good morning, Lady Arya," Brienne said with a polite nod. Arya still felt strange at the title, but she returned the nod. "Good morning, Sir Brienne. I hoped I might have a word," Brienne continued, glancing around. Her breath fogged in the cold air, but she spoke with quiet urgency. "About the stability of the realm." Arya's eyes narrowed, curiosity piqued. "Of course." They walked toward a quieter corner of the courtyard, near a section of the battlements that overlooked the frosty fields. From this vantage point, one could see the sun glinting off the roofs of Wintertown and the distant Treeline. Brienne took a breath, her expression serious. "I've traveled extensively these past months on behalf of the king," she began, folding her arms. "Most people are grateful for the peace, but there are pockets of discontent. Men who serve the Lannisters, men who resent the Targaryen threat that once was, and men who simply chafe at any form of centralized order. Nothing concrete, but I worry it could grow." Arya nodded slowly. "We've heard these whispers. You think there's a real risk?" Brienne sighed. "Potentially. Some may rally behind a figure they see as more legitimate than the current arrangement. I don't know who that might be, but ambition is rarely in short supply. Your union with Gendry was a stroke of genius on Jon's part, linking the Baratheon name to the Starks once again, but some might twist that as well." Arya frowned. "Twist it how?" "Perhaps they'll say House Stark seeks to dominate both the North and the Stormlands, or that Gendry, as a legitimized Baratheon, could stake some claim to the Iron Throne, though that's not how succession was settled under the new king." Brienne paused. "Politics can be perverse." Arya gave a soft snort. "He doesn't want the Iron Throne. Neither of us do. I know that, but rumor mongers can spin anything into a threat. If you return to Storm's End and find yourself facing subtle provocations or spies, be prepared." Arya studied the knight's earnest face. She had long respected Brienne, her honor, her loyalty. It struck Arya that Brienne had spent much of her life protecting others, from Renly Baratheon to Catelyn Stark to Sansa. Now she was still at it, safeguarding the fragile peace of Westeros. "Thank you for warning me," Arya said quietly. "We'll keep our eyes open." Brienne nodded, her posture relaxing slightly. "I'm glad, and if you ever need assistance, you have friends in the Kingsguard, and in me. Though I'm no longer bound to any single lord or lady as a sworn sword, I am loyal to House Stark." A small smile curved Arya's lips. "That's good to know." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, the winter sun reflecting off patches of snow. Then Brienne excused herself to check on some matter of security, leaving Arya alone with her thoughts. So the realm's stability was more precarious than it appeared. Arya felt a familiar stir of wariness, the same readiness she used to carry when traveling alone. Threats rarely attacked head-on. They gathered in the shadows first, seeding doubt and fear. She'd have to discuss this with Gendry, Jon, and Sansa, ensure they were prepared. Later that day, she found Gendry in the courtyard, conversing with a couple of blacksmiths about forging techniques for horseshoes that wouldn't slip on ice. She waited until he finished, then pulled him aside. As they stood beneath the archway leading toward the armory, she relayed what Brienne had told her. Gendry's brows knitted in concern. "It makes sense," he admitted. "I never wanted any throne, but bastards and claims have been used before to stir rebellions." Arya's expression hardened. "If they try to use you, they'll find out you're not so easily manipulated." He rested a hand on the pommel of the short sword he carried. "We should let Jon and Sansa know, and then once we head back to Storm's End, we stay alert. Anyone sneaking around or trying to spread false rumors, we cut it off at the root," Arya finished. Her tone was cold and certain. She had no patience for cloak and dagger plots that threatened her family. They went to Jon, finding him in the Solar with Sansa, Bran, and a few advisors. After dismissing the others, they shared Brienne's concerns. Jon listened with a grave expression, Sansa's lips pressed thin. Bran simply watched, though a flicker of knowledge passed over his face. "We need more eyes in the south," Jon said at length. "People who can report back if certain lords begin to gather arms or hold secret councils." Sansa nodded. "We have a network of informants, but we'll strengthen it. Gendry, if you wouldn't mind, maybe you can gather reliable folk in the Stormlands. People loyal to you who can keep watch for suspicious activity." Gendry agreed. "Yes, of course. I'll speak with Harold Bolling when we return." Arya looked to Bran. "Have you seen anything? Any sign of a plot forming?" Bran's gaze went distant for a moment. "I see flickers, fragments of men in dark cloaks, speaking in hushed rooms. But it's scattered. No single banner stands out yet. That means they haven't coalesced around a single figure." Sansa's eyes narrowed. They could be searching for one. Arya crossed her arms, mind racing through possibilities. The realm was large, and the memory of recent wars was still raw. Some might see the new peace as a chance to exploit weaknesses or exploit old grudges. She refused to let them succeed. She glanced at Gendry, seeing his resolve mirrored in his set jaw. Jon straightened. "All right, Arya, Gendry, you'll return to Storm's End soon and keep watch. We'll coordinate any information we receive here. If you sense even a hint of organized rebellion, send word immediately." A silent agreement passed among them, a vow to stand united again if a new threat emerged. Arya could see in Jon's eyes the same determination that had carried him through the wars. He would not let Westeros descend into chaos once more. Sansa's posture spoke of unwavering resolve, and Bran, though quiet, emanated that eerie confidence that came from seeing so many possible futures. That night, Arya and Gendry prepared to leave within a day or two, ensuring the supplies and guards were ready. Their retinue would be slightly larger this time, as they carried not just themselves but also messages, documents, and gifts from the north to the Stormlands. Arya dreaded the slower pace that might impose, but she knew it was necessary. In a small moment of respite, they walked the battlements of Winterfell under a sky strewn with stars. The snow-blanketed courtyard lay silent below, and the torches flickered on the walls, casting dancing shadows across the stone. Arya pulled her cloak tighter against the chill, her breath pluming in the crisp air. "You know," Gendry said quietly, "I never realized how much I missed the stars at night until I lived in a city filled with torchlight." Arya gazed upward. "They're clearer here in the north. Storm's End has storms, so half the time we don't see much of anything at night." He chuckled, slipping an arm around her for warmth. She allowed it, feeling a flutter of comfort. In the distance, she could see a flicker of movement, a guard patrolling the far wall. The realm's vigilance never truly slept. "We'll handle whatever comes," Gendry said, as though reading her thoughts. Arya nodded, resting her head lightly against his shoulder. "Yes, we will." There was no waver in her voice. They departed Winterfell on a cold morning, bidding farewell to Jon, Sansa, and Bran. The siblings exchanged hugs, Jon clasping Gendry's hand, Sansa offering Arya a final piece of advice about the Southern Lords, and Bran gifting Arya with a small carved box containing an old map he claimed might be useful. When Arya asked what was special about it, Bran simply said, "You'll know if you need it." In that cryptic way of his, the party set out, banners of the wolf and stag fluttering in a brisk northern wind. The roads south were as challenging as before, but the company was prepared with sturdy horses, provisions for cold weather, and a careful itinerary. Once again, they navigated the Neck and the rolling plains, the farmland of the Reach, and on toward the Stormlands. Along the way, they stopped at certain holdfasts, carrying letters from Sansa and Jon to local lords, ensuring lines of communication remained open. Throughout the journey, Arya kept a sharp eye for anything unusual, strange riders following them, local gossip suggesting new alliances. But they encountered little more than the usual minor brigands or traveling merchants. Still, she didn't let her guard down. Gendry, too, spoke with innkeepers and villagers, discreetly questioning if they'd heard talk of discontent. Most shook their heads, saying times were better now than they had been in years. When at last the storms of the Stormlands embraced them, Arya felt a strange sense of returning to a second home. The wind and rain battered their company as they approached the imposing fortress of Storm's End. Gendry rode at the head, shoulders squared, and she rode beside him, scanning the ramparts for any sign of trouble. Instead, she saw the familiar standards snapping in the wind. The gates opened, and they entered amid the salutes of guards. Servants rushed out with cloaks and towels, and Harold Bolling stood in the courtyard, bowing to welcome them. His face showed genuine relief at their return. "My lord, my lady, Storm's End is glad to have you back." Gendry dismounted, handing the reins to a stable boy. "How are things, Harold?" The steward nodded. "All is well, though we had a particularly fierce storm last week that damaged some of the outbuildings. I've already sent men to repair them. Beyond that, we've had few issues." Arya stepped forward, her cloak dripping with rain. "Any unusual visitors or messages?" Harold shook his head. "Only a few merchants. No word of trouble." She and Gendry exchanged a glance, relieved yet cautious. They made their way inside, the warmth of the fortress a welcome contrast to the driving rain. Once in the solar, they removed their soaked cloaks and settled around the hearth. Servants brought hot cider, and Gendry began sharing news from the north with Harold. Arya listened, noticing how each time Gendry spoke, there was a confidence in his voice that had owned since they first arrived months ago. This was his domain as much as anyone's, and he was stepping into the role with a sense of ownership. When the talk with Harold ended, and the steward departed to make arrangements for the new arrivals, Arya and Gendry found themselves alone. A gust of wind rattled the shutters, and rain spattered against the glass. Arya sank into a chair near the fire, boots leaving puddles on the stone floor. Gendry took the seat across from her, stretching his legs with a weary sigh. "It's good to be back," he admitted, eyes flicking to the window. "Despite the storms." Arya smirked. "I suppose I missed them. The north is cold, but at least the snow doesn't soak you through like this." They shared a quiet moment, the crackle of the fire lending a cozy background. Despite the weather, Storm's End felt alive. Maybe it always did, perpetually locked in battle with the elements. She could hear the distant hum of activity, servants moving about, the faint ring of a hammer in the armory, the wind howling against stone. This was her life now, half wolf, half storm, stepping between two worlds. Gendry tapped his fingers on the arm of the chair. "We should call a small council soon. Let everyone know we're back and ensure we keep an eye out for any suspicious activity." Arya nodded. "Agreed. And maybe we should send scouts along the major roads to see if there's been unusual traffic, just in case." He offered a grin. "I like how you think." They rose to make the necessary arrangements, the water from their cloaks already forming a small puddle by the hearth. Outside, the storm raged on, and Arya felt an odd sense of kinship with it. Storm's End was no gentle haven, but neither was she a woman who sought gentle havens. Perhaps that was why, beneath all the duty and caution, she found a spark of contentment here. Within the week, they convened a small council in the Great Hall, not as large as any royal gathering but enough to bring the key figures of Storm's End together. Harold Balling, a few local lords, the captain of the guard, and a couple of master craftsmen who managed the armory and stables. They discussed the fortress's defenses, the status of the villages and farms, and the possibility of forging stronger trade ties with ports to the south. When the topic turned to rumors of unrest, Gendry spoke firmly about their vigilance. He refrained from revealing everything Brienne and the Starks had shared, but he made it clear that Storm's End would not tolerate sedition. Arya watched the assembled faces, noting who reacted with surprise, who with concern, and who kept their expressions carefully neutral. She saw no obvious sign of treachery, but she remembered that conspiracies rarely advertised themselves in public forums. After the meeting, Harold approached them in the corridor. "You spoke of possible unrest in the realm, my lord, my lady. Do you truly expect trouble?" Arya studied him. Harold was straightforward, not prone to deception. She answered, "We don't know yet, but we have reason to be cautious." Harold nodded thoughtfully. "If there's anything I can do to assist, you only have to say." "We'll keep that in mind," Gendry replied. "For now, let's just make sure everything here is in order." Harold bowed and left them. Arya met Gendry's gaze. "If there is a threat, it's not showing itself openly." Gendry shrugged. "That might be a good thing. Maybe they're still too scattered to act." She allowed a small sigh of relief. "Let's hope so, but we won't lower our guard." And so they settled back into the rhythms of Storm's End. Gendry inspected the armory and oversaw expansions to the storage facilities for grain and salted fish. Arya visited the outlying villages, ensuring winter supplies were stocked. The days passed swiftly, each one bringing a new flurry of tasks. Occasionally, a raven arrived from the north or from King's Landing. The messages were mostly routine, trade updates, local disputes being resolved, but no alarming news of rebellion. Yet, in the back of Arya's mind, Brienne's warning lingered. She continued her habit of training daily, both in archery and swordplay, sometimes sparring with the guard captain. The men had grown accustomed to her skill, and more than one guard told her they slept easier knowing their lady was as deadly as she was. Gendry, for his part, found time to assist in the forges. Though he no longer worked as a common smith, he couldn't resist the call of hot metal and ringing steel. Sometimes Arya stopped by to watch him shape iron or supervise the forging of new blades. She enjoyed seeing him in his element, sweat glistening on his brow, arms moving with practiced ease. He was not simply a lord by name. He had the hands of a craftsman, a man who understood the raw process of forging from start to finish. One such afternoon, as she leaned against the stone wall of the forge, Gendry finished hammering a glowing piece of steel into a rough blade shape. He cooled it, then set it aside, wiping his brow. Noticing Arya's presence, he grinned. "Can't stay away from the smell of hot metal?" he teased, tossing his apron aside. She shrugged with a faint smile. "I like to watch you work. Reminds me of who you are." He tilted his head. "And who am I?" "You're a smith who became a lord," she answered simply. "But you haven't forgotten what made you who you are." His grin softened into something more thoughtful. "I suppose that's true. And you're a lady who doesn't want to be a lady. But you haven't forgotten who you are either." She smirked. "We'll never fit perfectly into these roles, will we?" He moved closer, the warmth of the forge radiating between them. "Maybe that's why it works." Her heart gave a small flutter at the honesty in his voice. She rested a hand on his chest, feeling the steady thud of his heart. In that moment, it struck her how far they had come. Two individuals shaped by war and fate, finding some sense of partnership in the storm-swept castle. It wasn't the romance of songs, but it was theirs. Their quiet interlude was interrupted by a messenger hurrying into the courtyard, calling for them. They exchanged a quick glance, then left the forge. Outside, the rain had eased to a drizzle, and the messenger bowed breathlessly. "A raven has arrived, my lord, my lady," he reported. "It bears the seal of King's Landing." Gendry wiped the sweat from his forehead, exchanging a knowing look with Arya. "Bring it to the solar. We'll read it there." The messenger nodded, darting off. Arya and Gendry followed, hearts pounding slightly faster. A letter from the crown could mean many things. Perhaps it was more routine business, or perhaps it was news of trouble. The wind hissed against the castle walls, as though urging them onward. In the solar, Harold Bolling already stood with the sealed parchment in hand, waiting. Gendry took it, breaking the wax seal carefully. Arya peered over his shoulder as he unrolled the letter. She recognized the crisp, measured handwriting as that of Lord Davos Seaworth, a close advisor in King Bran's council. Gendry read aloud, "My Lord and Lady Baratheon, I hope this letter finds you in health. I write to inform you that certain lords in the Reach and in the Westerlands have been meeting in private. We do not have evidence of a direct plot, but their gatherings have raised concerns. The king advises vigilance, especially in the Stormlands, which may be targeted for alliances or infiltration should these lords seek to undermine the stability of the realm. We urge you to maintain readiness. Any information you gather should be sent at once to King's Landing. In service, Davos Seaworth." Arya exhaled slowly, a tense hush enveloping the solar. Gendry lowered the letter, brow furrowed. "So it begins," he muttered. She nodded, mind already spinning with possibilities. Lords in the Reach and Westerlands, the old strongholds once loyal to the Tyrells and Lannisters. Cersei had been defeated, but not all her supporters would have faded into the shadows. If they were meeting, they could be seeking a figurehead or a common cause to rally behind. Harold spoke cautiously. "Shall we send word back that we'll keep watch?" Gendry nodded. "Yes, and we need to tighten security around the castle. More patrols on the roads, especially near the border with the Reach. If there's infiltration, we'll catch wind of it." Arya's jaw tightened. "I'll send out some trusted scouts as well. Quietly. We don't want to tip anyone off." Harold bowed. "Right away, my lady." He left, and Gendry turned to Arya. "This is it," he said, voice grim. "The first stirrings." She took a breath, recollecting all she had learned from war and subterfuge. "Let's not panic. We're prepared, or at least more prepared than before." He placed the letter on the table, meeting her gaze with a resolve that matched her own. "Then we stand together, Storm's End and Winterfell, the North and the Crown. If anyone tries to break the peace, they'll find we're not so easily broken." Outside, a gust of wind rattled the shutters, and distant thunder rolled. Arya stared at the letter, feeling the weight of responsibility press upon her shoulders. Jon, Sansa, and Bran had foreseen this possibility. Brienne had warned of it. Now the faint ripples of unrest were beginning to form. But she was Arya Stark, and she would not let Westeros slip back into chaos. Beside her, Gendry Baratheon stood as an ally and partner, ready to meet whatever storm loomed on the horizon. The stag and the wolf had joined forces once more. For the sake of the realm, they would ensure that union held, no matter what tempests sought to tear it apart.